Olenna Tyrell sat in the shade of a lemon tree in the gardens of the Red Keep, her sharp eyes scanning the courtyard for any sign of eavesdroppers. Age had not dulled her wits, nor had her grief tempered her desire for revenge. In the weeks since Margaery's imprisonment by the Faith Militant, the Queen of Thorns had meticulously studied the new order rising in King's Landing. The High Sparrow's power seemed to wax with the sun each morning, and Cersei Lannister's precarious hold over the city had become more obvious to anyone with sense. Olenna's wrinkled fingers fiddled with a small cameo brooch pinned to her bodice, the last gift Margaery had given her before leaving Highgarden for the capital. Though she would never outwardly show it, Olenna was worried. She was not a woman prone to illusions. Her granddaughter was locked in a cell. Loras was imprisoned as well. The Tyrell name, so carefully nurtured and grown like a rose in sunshine, was now under threat of irrelevancy or ruin if she did not act. She was not a woman of blind piety. The Seven were prayed to out of tradition and respect, but Olenna's faith in gods was overshadowed by her belief in family, power, and the coin that bought influence. However, as she considered the dawn of a new day in King's Landing, she realized something crucial. The High Sparrow was a man who had harnessed the fervor of the faithful to serve his own cause. While so many, Cersei chief among them, underestimated the potential of the commoner's faith, Olenna saw an opportunity. She had spent decades learning how to strangle vines before they could choke her roses, and now she intended to fertilize and water one vine in particular so that it might climb over the walls and topple them from within. The High Sparrow, with his ragged robes and simple speech, had outmaneuvered the mighty Lannisters in placing Tommen and his mother into a position of desperate appeasement. He made Cersei kneel with fear of being imprisoned, or worse, publicly humiliated again. She had brought it on herself in many ways. Olenna was not sympathetic to the Lannister queen. She found it all a delicious bit of irony, if only her own granddaughter and grandson weren't caught in the tangles as well. But she had the coin, and now she needed the faith. In a city of half-starved smallfolk who worshipped the Seven for deliverance, and in a power structure that had fractured since the death of Tywin Lannister, the High Sparrow was a king of conscience. If Olenna could form a quiet alliance with him, coin and cunning from her side, righteous zeal from his, they might remake King's Landing, perhaps all of Westeros, in a new image. Margaery and Loras could be free, House Tyrell would be firmly planted in the capital, and Cersei would be left a relic of her own folly. Such was Olenna's thinking as she paced the fragrant gardens. She didn't particularly like the man. The High Sparrow was austere to the point of irritation, but she did not need to like him. She needed to respect his power. And if he truly believed himself a servant of the Seven, perhaps even a champion of the poor and the downtrodden, then Olenna would dangle a carrot of opportunity before him. Real structural change in the city, paid for by House Tyrell's overflowing coffers. She could see it now. Clean streets, plenty of bread, more septs for worship, and the faith militant growing unstoppable. The small folk would revere him like a living saint. Meanwhile, Olenna would sit behind him, calm and unassuming, ensuring the Tyrells were recognized as the new seat of authority. Little by little, that authority could overshadow the monarchy itself, or whatever the monarchy had become under Tommen. Perhaps, she mused, if Margaery was reunited with Tommen on terms more favorable to the faith, the Tyrells could steer the entire realm into a fresh arrangement. But first, she needed a private conversation with the High Sparrow. That, in itself, was no easy matter. She could not simply announce her desire to see the man, as Cersei had once done so arrogantly. Olenna would have to be subtle, feeding the seeds of rumor through the novices, ensuring her arrival at the September of Baelor felt humble, purposeful, and not in the least suspicious. She had written a note herself, in the plainest paper and simplest script possible, half disguising her own elegant hand. She had paid a street urchin a gold dragon to deliver it, ensuring that no Tyrell livery would be seen. No glimmer of the family's wealth would tip off watchful eyes. In it, she had been careful to show repentance, a desire to meet the High Sparrow to discuss the moral standing of her family, how to atone for the sins of her grandchildren, how to bring them back into the Seven's light. Polite entreaty. She had no doubt the High Sparrow's curiosity would be piqued. 2 nights later, Olenna Tyrell, escorted only by a single trusted guard in plain clothing, slipped through the side streets of King's Landing toward the Hill of Baelor. The city had grown more dangerous since war had broken out in the realm, with many opportunistic thieves prowling in the darkness. But the presence of the faith militant also added an element of order. Ironically, armed with cudgels and star-emblazoned armor, barefoot men marched the alleys, pulling drunks out into the street for questioning, rooting out the seedier elements of the city. Olenna's guard kept a hand near his sword, though she had cautioned him repeatedly that the best way to remain safe was to remain uninteresting. Few would suspect the elderly, stout woman in a heavy hood and cloak was the formidable Lady Olenna Tyrell. After all, they reached the side entrance of the Great September. Olenna could see flickering torchlight on the massive stone pillars and the carved faces of the seven overhead. Despite her pragmatic nature, she felt a small shiver run down her spine. She had visited the September of Baelor many times as a lady of the court, always making an appearance to maintain the image of pious generosity. But those events were filled with gold-trimmed processions, the smell of perfumed incense, and the presence of half the lords and ladies in the city. Now, it felt different, darker, quieter, and possessed of a somber energy she had not sensed before. It occurred to her that the High Sparrow had changed everything about the place, chasing away the extravagance and leaving only bare floors, candles, and the cold hush of devotion. She nodded to her guard, who remained by the door. A novice awaited her inside. A young woman, her head shaved close, wearing simple gray robes. The novice led Olenna through a vaulted hallway. The old woman's slippers echoed on the stone. Lanterns dangled overhead, swaying gently. She passed a row of altars, each dedicated to a different aspect of the seven: the father, the mother, the warrior, the maiden, the smith, the crone, the stranger. Even in the dim light, the statues looked newly scrubbed of any gold or jewels that once adorned them. This was indeed a new order. Finally, they arrived at a small, unassuming chamber. The novice bowed and slipped away, leaving Olenna alone with the High Sparrow, who rose from a plain wooden bench. He still wore the same rough-spun robe tied with a rope at the waist. He looked both frail and strong at the same time, like one of those desert hermits from the other side of the sea. His eyes were keen, curious but not overtly hostile. He gave a slight incline of the head, which Olenna returned more stiffly. "My lady," he said in a voice that barely carried over the sound of distant chanting. "I received your note. I was pleased to hear you wish to speak on matters of atonement." Olenna let a thin smile creep over her lips. "I do indeed wish to speak, but let's not waste time. We both know who I am. We both know why I'm here. My grandchildren, Marjorie and Loras, languish in your cells. I want them freed." She paused, observing how the High Sparrow's expression remained politely neutral. "You and I both know a woman like me wouldn't come unless she was prepared to make an offering." He folded his hands in front of him. "An offering should be made to the seven, my lady, not to me. I am but their servant." She dipped her head in acknowledgement, hardly convinced by his show of humility. "Spare me the homilies, dear. We both know you hold enormous power in your hands, whether you like to admit it or not. You know I have resources you lack. But perhaps we share some common ground. The city is in disarray, the monarchy uncertain. Chaos can bring about reflection and reformation, yes, but it can also bring ruin to the commoners for whom you care. The war has left many hungry, fatherless, or motherless. The influx of refugees from the riverlands and beyond continues to swell the city. Disease spreads in Flea Bottom. Bread is scarce. All the while, the Lannisters attempt to keep a stranglehold on the throne, ignoring the plight of the masses. And in that vacuum, men like you have stepped forward to clothe and feed them. Her words were purposeful. She spoke not just to secure the release of her kin, but to plant the seeds of a greater ambition. The High Sparrow gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging the truth in her statements. "We have done our best with what little we have. The offerings from the pious help feed the hungry. The faith militant keeps order when the gold cloaks would neglect those in the shadows. But we are only the instruments of the seven. Our duty is to do as they will." Olenna smiled dryly. Indeed. Now, the seven want for justice, do they not? For equity, for compassion for the poor. But that justice is often denied when the realm is ruled by those who care only for their own comfort. The Lannisters, especially Cersei, have shown they will not hesitate to persecute perceived enemies, from the Tyrells to your own faith. They maneuver and twist laws when it suits them. Do you not think it is time for a change? His gaze studied her closely. A change, you say? And does that change mean seating another queen upon the throne? Marjorie is still queen by marriage, Olenna said, raising her chin. But she's locked away. Think of what could happen if she were back in a position of power. If we could guarantee that the monarchy served the faith, that gold would flow to the city for the building of new septs, the feeding of the poor, all in the name of the seven. If the queen herself were to champion the faith and the small folk, and if House Tyrell were to lend its wealth to the cause, well, that might accomplish far more than you toiling here day and night. She let silence linger before adding, of course, such an arrangement might require the removal of certain obstacles, Cersei among them. But we must be sure the faith stands behind Marjorie. I would not have her thrown into a cell again the moment it's convenient to do so. He did not speak immediately. The High Sparrow had always projected an air of unwavering moral fortitude. Yet even a man who believed as deeply as he did had to recognize the practical realities. If he wanted to keep feeding the poor, if he wanted to keep the faith militant strong, he would need coin. The crown was in debt. The Lannisters had pockets that ran deep, yes, but their influence had been waning, especially with Tywin gone and the gold mines near exhaustion. The Tyrells, however, were rumored to have as many resources as the Iron Bank of Bravos, if not more. Her pointed mention of building new septs and feeding the needy was a direct strike at his mission. I will not stoop to politics in the name of greed, he said at last, though there was a subtle shift in his eyes. But you are correct that the city needs more than piety alone. It needs material support to become a bastion of the Seven's grace. If House Tyrell is genuine in its desire to uplift the faith, I am bound to consider it. Genuine was hardly the word Olenna would have chosen, but outwardly she only nodded. Let us say House Tyrell is prepared to be extraordinarily generous. But there is another matter, justice for my grandchildren. Marjorie is being held on the charge of perjury and other trumped-up slanders. Loras is accused of sins of the flesh. If the faith were to find them, shall we say, redeemable, then the realm would see your mercy. They would see a chance for atonement and pardon. He gave her a measured look. All must answer for their sins, but the faith does value genuine repentance. If Marjorie and Loras are prepared to confess, to do penance, she held up a hand. They will do whatever is necessary, so long as it ensures their freedom. Confession can be arranged, penance can be performed, but it must be done in such a way that does not ruin them. Marjorie, above all, must maintain some dignity or she will lose the people's support. The High Sparrow considered, then inclined his head. If we can bring them back into the light of the seven, and if House Tyrell is to guide them onto a righteous path, we shall show mercy. And in return, you will provide the means to expand the faith's works throughout the city and beyond. Olenna nodded. She kept her voice calm and low, but inside she felt a surge of triumph. Beyond, indeed, a well-maintained faith militant could be a stabilizing force throughout the realm. We Tyrells would support that. There is enough bloodshed in these wars. Perhaps the Seven's peace might come if the devout among the populace see that there is a better way, a well-funded way. A hush settled between them. The High Sparrow's stare was heavy, as though he weighed the sincerity of her words. Olenna took no offense. She wore her cunning on her sleeve. The High Sparrow undoubtedly knew her faith was minimal at best, but she suspected he would not squander such an opportunity. Finally, he gave a small nod. Very well. I shall speak with the other sparrows. We shall begin a process of re-education for your grandchildren. They shall repent before the seven. When the time is right, they shall be restored to their positions at court. Then, I trust your generosity will blossom like your house sigil. Olenna's lips curved in a thin smile. Count on it. The people will come to see the Tyrell rose in a new light, and if it is entwined with the star of the faith, all the better. She turned to leave, leaning on her cane more heavily than she would have liked, her bones reminding her that she was not as young as she once was. But as she walked away from the small chamber, she felt a fierce satisfaction. The seeds had been planted. With luck and cunning, they would grow into a vine strong enough to choke Cersei's hold on the throne. Olenna Tyrell had partnered with the High Sparrow, and King's Landing would never be the same. Over the next several weeks, the city saw subtle shifts in the balance of power, though few understood that Olenna Tyrell and the High Sparrow had come to a secret accord. Marjorie was allowed limited visitors, always novices of the faith who read from holy texts in her presence and spoke of redemption. She appeared in public only once, walking the courtyard of the September under heavy guard, a look of resolve on her face that both stirred pity and admiration among the common people. Rumors began to swirl that the Tyrell matriarch was donating large sums for the building of new soup kitchens and expansions to existing seps. Slowly, quietly, the presence of the faith militant expanded into new roles, patrolling markets to prevent theft, offering mediation in disputes among tradesmen, and setting up night vigils in the worst corners of Flea Bottom to protect the destitute. Naturally, Cersei noticed. She prowled the halls of the Red Keep like a caged lioness, suspicious of every new rumor. Tommen, being the gentle boy he was, seemed to approve of feeding the poor, but she was not as easily placated. She summoned Olenna to a tense meeting in the Solar. "I've heard you're paying for new seps and charities all over the city," Cersei said, swirling wine in her cup. Her tone was edged, her eyes searching. "How very generous of House Tyrell. Perhaps I should thank you for taking such a burden off the crown's coffers." Olenna sat calmly, her back as straight as her old bones allowed. "House Tyrell has always been generous. We are, after all, the major supplier of food to the realm. Given the burdens of war, it seemed prudent to ease the suffering of the small folk. I would think you'd approve. After all, you have so often spoken of your concern for King's Landing, have you not?" Cersei's nostrils flared slightly. It was no secret that her personal finances were not as flush as she liked. The Lannister mines had run dry. The Iron Bank was calling in debts. Meanwhile, the Tyrell purse remained famously large. "I do," she said, forcing a smile. "I also hear that Marjorie is close to making some confession. Is it true the faith might soon release her?" Olenna lifted a brow. "The faith works in mysterious ways, dear. I cannot say exactly when, but I am hopeful. My granddaughter has always been devout, after all. She just needed a reminder of her spiritual duties." Cersei's mask of politeness slipped. "I see. Well, be sure you don't allow her to promise too much to these barefoot zealots. The crown is still the authority here. The faith would do well to remember that." Olenna cocked her head. "Certainly, the crown's authority remains intact. As to how Tommen chooses to share that authority with the faith, or with Marjorie upon her release, that remains to be seen. A mother can guide her son, of course, but can she guarantee he will follow?" She let the question hang in the air, enjoying the flicker of anger in Cersei's eyes. Then Olenna bowed her head. "If you'll excuse me, the hour grows late, and an old woman needs her rest." She rose, leaving Cersei behind to glare into her wine. A hush fell over the city as word spread that Marjorie Tyrell was to make a public confession of her sins on the steps of the Great September of Baelor. The day dawned with a brisk wind that carried the clamor of bells tolling across King's Landing. A crowd gathered at the foot of the great marble steps. Members of the faith militant, wearing their seven-pointed star, formed two lines to keep back the onlookers. Among them were ragged men and women, the poor and downtrodden, as well as a smattering of nobles, seeking some vantage to witness the spectacle. At last Marjorie emerged. She was clothed more modestly than anyone had ever seen her, her once lavish gowns replaced by a plain gray robe. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, lacking the intricate braids she used to wear. She looked pale but determined, her gaze steady as she was led by two septas to the top of the steps. The High Sparrow stood nearby, hands folded in front of him. Olenna watched from the front row, flanked by her guards. She felt a pang in her chest, seeing her granddaughter so stripped of the trappings of royalty. But she also recognized the importance of this moment. Margaery would humble herself before the city, prove her devotion to the Seven, and then the faith would restore her. They had arranged it carefully, ensuring it would not become a humiliating walk of atonement like Cersei's, but rather a measured confession. The High Sparrow's voice carried, calm yet resonant. We are gathered before the Seven to hear the words of one who has strayed from their path, but who seeks to return to the light. Margaery Tyrell, do you come here of your own free will? Her voice trembled slightly, but she spoke clearly. I do. And do you confess to lying before the gods, to concealing sins that should have been laid bare? She swallowed. Olenna felt her heart pound. I confess I have lied. I have not always been truthful. With the faith, I have hidden truths about my brother's preferences, though I knew them to be frowned upon by the Seven. I confess also to pride in my status, my beauty, my position. The crowd murmured. Some looked scandalized, others sympathetic. But this was precisely the performance Olenna had orchestrated with the High Sparrow's help. Margaery would concede just enough wrongdoing to appear humbled, but not so much as to destroy her reputation entirely. The High Sparrow lifted a hand. She has confessed her sins. Shall we turn her away, or shall we offer her the Seven's mercy? Mercy, came a shout from somewhere in the crowd. Others joined in, though a few pious voices might have cried for further punishment. The High Sparrow looked to the crowd and then nodded gravely. Then we shall grant her the opportunity for atonement, that she may serve the realm and the faith. We shall guide her on the path of righteousness. He placed a hand on Margaery's bowed head. Margaery Tyrell, rise. Show the realm that you will be a queen of compassion and devotion. She stood slowly, meeting the High Sparrow's gaze. There was no triumphant smirk or display of victory. Her face was carefully schooled into an expression of solemn resolution. Olenna Tyrell exhaled softly, feeling relief. The crowd parted as Margaery stepped down. The faith militant did not force her to walk naked or endure the leers of the masses as Cersei had done. Instead, Margaery walked calmly back into the Great September, flanked by novices and septas chanting prayers. Over the next few days, she would be reintegrated into the life of the court, closely monitored by the faith. All according to Olenna's plan and, presumably, the High Sparrow's. Cersei watched from a balcony, her lips pressed into a thin line. Olenna did not look up at her. She knew the Lannister queen would be seething. This outcome was too mild, too dignified, leaving Margaery with a sympathetic image. The small folk in the streets had already begun to chant about the generosity of the Tyrells, rumor of free bread and wine floating around. The Tyrell rose was blossoming in the hearts of the people, and Cersei's own humiliating walk from weeks past was still fresh in everyone's minds. Far more brutal, far less merciful. It was a pointed contrast. Nor had Olenna forgotten Loras. His confession was trickier, as the faith frowned more harshly on his unnatural sins. But the Tyrell matriarch had struck a deal with the High Sparrow. Loras would be allowed to renounce his inheritance and join the faith militant, effectively removing him from the line of succession and freeing him from the dungeons. It would not be the life Loras would have chosen, but Olenna could not risk further damage to the family's reputation. At least he would live, and, in time, perhaps the arrangement could be revised. For now, it kept him alive and ended the public scandal. All of this, though, was only a stepping stone toward the larger goal: ousting Cersei. In the weeks that followed, King's Landing shifted again. Margaery returned to the Red Keep, adopting a more visibly pious routine. She frequently visited orphans, distributed alms, and visited septs all around the city to pray. She was accompanied by novitiates of the faith, but also by ladies from smaller noble houses who had flocked to her side. Her regal manners and gentle smiles captivated the common folk. They began to see her as the true power behind Tommen, a queen who cared. Olenna ensured a steady flow of gold for these charitable efforts. Grain from the Reach was distributed freely, and more building projects commenced. The faith, flush with Tyrell funds, erected new altars in poor districts, financed improvements to city walls that had fallen into disrepair, and spread the word that all was being done in the name of the Seven and the generosity of House Tyrell. Such works made the High Sparrow's influence soar. Where once the city was divided between fear and resentment of the faith militant, now the poor saw them as guardians. House Tyrell's alliance with the faith was becoming an accepted reality. On the other side of the ledger, Cersei fought to maintain her grip. She tried to remind Tommen that he was king, that he should not allow Margaery and the faith to run the city's affairs. But Tommen saw the positive changes, saw how the people's anger was soothed, and his own timid heart found solace in the idea that his rule could be gentler, kinder. He spent time listening to Margaery's suggestions quietly shaped by Olenna. Bit by bit, Cersei's counsel seemed less appealing to him, and whenever she ventured to speak ill of the High Sparrow, Tommen would shy away from the conflict, leaving his mother increasingly isolated. From a strategic standpoint, Olenna watched all this with a calculating eye. The next crucial step was ensuring that Cersei would have no allies left to shield her. She had alienated many houses already, and with Kevan Lannister's uneasy truce in the capital overshadowed by Tyrell influence, Cersei's position was precarious. Jaime was away from the city, dealing with matters in Riverrun and beyond. Qyburn lurked in the Red Keep, overseeing his sinister experiments and controlling the reanimated Ser Robert Strong. But that alone might not be enough if the entire city turned against Cersei. What Olenna needed was a final push, some event that would break Cersei's power for good and allow the faith, backed by the Tyrells, to seize control. Ironically, it was Cersei herself who provided that event. She demanded a trial by combat for her upcoming trial on charges of regicide, the death of King Robert, as the faith was investigating anew, and adultery. She believed wholeheartedly in Ser Robert Strong's ability to defeat any champion the faith might put forward. The High Sparrow, on the other hand, was determined to ban the barbaric tradition of trial by combat, insisting that trial by 7 judges of the faith would be the righteous way. Tensions mounted. The city buzzed with anticipation of whether the crown or the faith would yield. Behind closed doors, Olenna supported the High Sparrow's stance, quietly funneling coin to bribe a number of lesser officials who had a say in these matters. The logic was straightforward. If the faith could abolish trial by combat, Cersei would be forced into a normal trial, where she could be found guilty by evidence and testimony. No monstrous knight could save her. Then came the day the royal edict was announced. By decree of King Tommen, the practice of trial by combat was abolished, replaced by the faith's system of judgment. The Great September was to be the location of the trial, presided over by the High Sparrow and 6 other judges, all men of high standing in the faith. Cersei, who had pinned her survival on Ser Robert Strong, was stunned. She confronted Tommen in his chambers, screaming at him, demanding he restore her right to the old tradition. But Tommen, in a fit of guilt and fear, held firm. He had given his word to Margaery and the High Sparrow, who had convinced him that trial by combat was an affront to justice, that it was the wealthy and powerful who benefited most from such battles while the poor could never hope to defend themselves. Olenna did not witness that confrontation, but she heard the rumors quickly. She imagined the look on Cersei's face: shock, rage, a sense of betrayal. Cersei had built her entire life around wielding fear and cunning to protect her children and herself. To be undone by her own son's gentle idealism must have cut deeper than any knife. Olenna could almost sympathize, but she smiled at the thought. Cersei's downfall was nearly complete. Still, she knew the Lannister queen would not go quietly. Cersei was dangerous when cornered. Olenna had not forgotten the wildfire rumors, that Cersei had learned the alchemical secrets once used by the Mad King. She did not fully trust the High Sparrow to keep an eye on every hidden corner. So, Olenna sent her own agents to watch the old cellars rumored to be stocked with wildfire. She had them quietly slip among the workers who toiled beneath the city, ensuring that no suspicious activity went unnoticed. The trial day arrived. The Great September of Baelor was filled to capacity, with lords, ladies, and commoners alike crammed in to watch. The 7 judges, led by the High Sparrow, took their seats near the altar. Cersei was summoned but did not appear. Even Marjorie's presence could not soothe the tension in the air. Tommen, by the High Sparrow's request, had remained at the Red Keep, protected by the Faith Militant. On the other side of the city, Olenna Tyrell sat in her litter, being carried toward the September by 4 strong men in Tyrell livery. She was eager to witness the final blow to Cersei's power. However, as she neared the plaza, she sensed something was wrong. The air smelled strange, acrid. The city seemed too still. People whispered of missing Faith Militant in the streets. One of her guards noticed that most of the watchful sparrows had disappeared from their usual posts. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the air. Olenna's litter was dropped as the men carrying it stumbled, wide-eyed. A ball of green fire burst high in the sky, swirling into a massive column. Screams erupted from every street. Smoke, tinted an eerie green, rose from the direction of the Great September. Olenna scrambled out of the litter, leaning on a guard's arm, feeling her heart pound. Wildfire. It had to be. She glimpsed a rolling wave of emerald flames soaring upward, like some demon's breath out of legend. Buildings near the September caught fire instantly. The blast was so powerful that bits of rubble and scorching debris rained on the nearby streets, setting them ablaze as well. The crowds that had been marching toward the September began to flee in terror. Olenna's first thought was Marjorie. She had arrived at the September early that morning to pray before the trial began. She was inside. Now all that might remain was green devastation. The old woman felt horror seize her. She grabbed her guard's arm so hard her knuckles went white. "We have to get out of here," she rasped. There was no possibility of rescue. Whatever was inside that September was gone. Anyone there, Marjorie, the High Sparrow, the Faith Militant, the lords and ladies, would have been incinerated in an instant. This was Cersei's doing, Olenna realized with a mingled sense of awe and hatred. The queen had not shown up at her own trial, and instead she had arranged to unleash wildfire beneath the September of Baelor. An unthinkable act. But Cersei Lannister was not one to be cornered. She had destroyed the entire structure in one cataclysmic blast, killing the High Sparrow, all the sparrows, and, gods have mercy, Marjorie. Even Loras, who was likely inside. Olenna couldn't breathe. Her plan, her carefully orchestrated alliance with the High Sparrow, had just gone up in green flames. Her grandchildren, the hope of House Tyrell, snuffed out in seconds. The faith leadership that had grown so powerful, now reduced to ash. There was no question in Olenna's mind that Cersei had committed mass murder, probably slaughtering half the city's nobles in the process. For a moment, she could only stare at the billowing green smoke. Her guard tugged at her arm, urging her to flee with the rest of the crowds as the fire spread. But in that moment of shock, something else came to Olenna's mind, perhaps the last piece of the puzzle. If Tommen had been in the September, he would also be dead. But the boy was not there. She recalled that the High Sparrow had insisted Tommen stay away for safety. That meant Cersei had targeted not just her enemies among the faith and the nobility, but she had also removed the presence of her own son. She had ensured the king was out of harm's way, at least physically. What Olenna did not know was that Tommen, upon realizing what had happened, that everyone in the Great September had been destroyed, would choose his own fate by stepping from a window of the Red Keep. The bells tolled once more that morning, not for the trial but for the king's death. Rumor spread like wildfire, no pun intended. King Tommen had leapt to his doom out of despair for Marjorie, for the cruelty of what his mother had done, for the city's unimaginable loss. Soon, word reached Olenna. Tommen was gone too, the last of Cersei's children, and so it was that, in one morning, the Lannisters had effectively destroyed the monarchy as it had been. Cersei was now the only living authority among them, a twisted queen who had crowned herself in the wake of the explosion. Olenna Tyrell's entire plan, her partnership with the High Sparrow, the dream of a faith-backed monarchy under Marjorie, everything had literally and figuratively gone up in flames. She had lost her grandson and granddaughter. She had lost her family's future. Her hatred for House Lannister burned brighter than the wildfire's embers. Yet she was not dead, and there was power in surviving. In the ruins that followed, the faith militant was scattered. With the High Sparrow and the rest of the Faith's senior leadership dead, there was no guiding hand to keep the Sparrows organized. Some tried to keep order on the streets, but the monarchy's horrifying show of force intimidated them into submission or retreat. House Tyrell's gold still existed, but that gold meant little without a direct line to the throne. Cersei wasted no time in declaring herself Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, ignoring any protests that it should pass to another. Fear settled over King's Landing, fear that Cersei might use wildfire again if challenged. Olenna retreated to the Tyrell manse in the city, guarded by her loyal retainers. Her heart was broken, but her mind was consumed by rage. She arranged caravans to leave for Highgarden, instructing the footmen and knights to gather what they could. Her time in King's Landing was finished. The small folk, once hopeful about the alliance of Faith and Tyrell, now cowered, uncertain of the future. She left the city under a pall of smoke, hearing rumors that the Red Keep's bells told a coronation for Cersei Lannister. The Queen of Thorns had never tasted a more bitter defeat. She had placed her trust, limited though it was, in a partnership with the High Sparrow, only for it to be shattered by the single most ruthless act she had seen in her long life. As her carriage rolled past the city gates, she looked back with stony eyes. The sun glinted off the scorched ruins around the sept, and the wind carried the stench of death. She pressed her lips together, vowing silently that Cersei would pay for this. She might have lost the battle in King's Landing, but the war was far from over. House Tyrell still commanded the fertile fields of the Reach, still possessed more gold than any other region, still had armies that outnumbered the Lannisters. And Olenna Tyrell might be old, but she was not finished. Faith had failed as a weapon, but coin and cunning remained. She would find a new way to bring down Cersei if it was the last thing she ever did. And so, all that remained of the alliance that might have overthrown Cersei with faith and coin was a scorched memory on the Hill of Baelor, a cautionary tale to those who played the Game of Thrones. Never corner a lioness, for she may unleash a hellfire no one could have anticipated. Yet, suppose for a moment we imagine a different outcome, a slight twist on that fateful day. An outcome where Olenna Tyrell's cunning might have anticipated Cersei's final gambit, where the High Sparrow's fervor might have been tempered by more vigilance and caution, where they might have ensured that trial by combat was not just abolished, but that every hidden rumor of wildfire was rooted out before the day of the trial. That was the path Olenna Tyrell had tried to steer toward, but she'd underestimated the depths to which Cersei would sink to preserve herself. In truth, even if they had discovered the caches beneath the September, might they have believed Cersei truly capable of igniting them, knowing it would cost countless lives? Perhaps they would have. Perhaps they would have recognized that a cornered queen is the most dangerous of all. Imagine if, instead, Olenna's spies in the underground passageways had uncovered suspicious movements, barrels being transported in secret. Perhaps they would have had the presence of mind to sabotage the plan. Or if the High Sparrow had demanded that Cersei attend the trial in the presence of half the city's population, leaving no chance for her to strike from afar. Or if Margaery, in her new devotion, had gleaned from Tommen some whispered hint of what Qyburn was up to, leading to an evacuation of the Great September before the appointed hour. In any of those scenarios, the entire tragic event could have been circumvented. But each of those scenarios required not just cunning, but swift, decisive action. The Faith, for all its moral fervor, was slow to suspect such a monstrous act. Olenna, for all her experience, placed too much trust in the idea that Cersei was crippled by fear and had no moves left. The partnership of faith and coin was powerful, but it lacked the lethal cunning that had kept Cersei alive through so many storms. Still, had Olenna and the High Sparrow prevailed that day, the shape of the Seven Kingdoms might have been unrecognizable. With Margaery free and beloved, with Tommen as a pliable boy-king, with the Faith militant controlling the city and the Tyrell coffers funding an era of broad religious expansion, it's not impossible that a theocracy of sorts would have taken root. Cersei's trial, absent a trial by combat, would have found her guilty. She might have been condemned to spend her remaining days in a silent septri, or even executed outright if the Faith's bloodlust was roused. Meanwhile, a triumphant High Sparrow, backed by Olenna Tyrell's gold, would have found himself not just a spiritual leader, but an architect of policy. Taxes to the Iron Throne might have been redirected into the Faith's works. The network of Sparrows expanded into a well-regulated police force. Margaery, outwardly pious, might have welcomed these changes if they secured her place as the adored queen. She would continue to charm the small folk, who would see in her a reflection of the mother's compassion. Tommen, overshadowed by his mother's condemnation, might have blossomed into a gentler king, supervised by the High Sparrow's moral strictures, whispered guidance from Margaery, and the quiet intimidation of Olenna behind the scenes. The color gold, golden roses, golden coins, would blend with the austere gray of the Faith's vestments, forging a new color palette for the city, a curious mix of opulence and ascetic devotion. Yet that same union of the Faith and House Tyrell would have sowed its own seeds of tension. Other regions might have balked at the idea of a religious monarchy. The North, under the sway of the old gods, would regard the Faith's growing power with suspicion. Dorne, with its own customs and a deep-seated hatred for the Lannisters, and by extension, any who had conspired in the murder of Elia Martell, might have been slow to accept a king so thoroughly controlled by the Faith. The Iron Islands, worshipping the drowned god, would certainly not bow to the High Sparrow's authority. Wars might have still erupted, albeit in a different shape. Nonetheless, within the capital, if the partnership had succeeded, if Cersei had been quietly removed or publicly tried, one can easily envision a more stable rule for a time, at least on the surface. Margaery would host lavish dinners for foreign envoys, but those dinners would be framed as charitable gatherings. The coin raised going to relief efforts or new seps. The commoners would see new glimpses of prosperity, bread lines replaced by structured distribution. The Sparrows, under the High Sparrow's watchful eye, might transform from a ragtag militia into a respected knightly order under the seven-pointed star, dedicated to serving the realm's poorest. Noble corruption, from petty bribes to heavier injustices, might be curbed under the threat of public piety. It would be a neat arrangement, at least for a while. But behind closed doors, Olenna Tyrell would remain pragmatic, ensuring that House Tyrell's lands and fortunes were protected. She would temper the High Sparrow's demands for moral purity whenever they threatened the Tyrell interests. The High Sparrow, for his part, would need her gold too much to risk angering her. And Margaery, gracefully moving between them, would play the part of a beloved queen, insisting on kindness, forging alliances with other houses, painting a veneer of harmony over the realm. Yet even in that scenario, one wonders if a new friction would arise. The High Sparrow might grow to resent the subtle manipulations of the Tyrell matriarch. Olenna might bristle at the High Sparrow's moral intrusions into the more worldly aspects of governance. The illusions of unity might crack, and if any new foe emerged, be it from across the sea or from the frozen north, would the realm be truly ready to face them, or would they be too consumed by their internal struggle for spiritual and political dominance? But such speculations are just that, speculations. In the reality that unfolded, as we know, Cersei's cunning and ruthlessness unleashed an inferno that took them all by surprise, devastating any chance that the Faith and House Tyrell could consolidate their power peacefully. In the ashes, Olenna Tyrell discovered a single, unyielding fact. She had lost nearly everything. She would venture to Dorne, forging a desperate alliance with Ellaria Sand in the hope of toppling Cersei once and for all, eventually throwing in her lot with the Targaryen queen from across the sea. But her old dream, an alliance of faith and coin that reshaped King's Landing, was gone. And so, to answer the question of what if Olenna Tyrell partnered with the High Sparrow, overthrowing Cersei by faith and coin, we must recognize that she did indeed attempt this partnership, only to be thwarted by Cersei's last, desperate maneuver. Had events gone slightly differently, with more vigilance or a more thorough infiltration of Cersei's secrets, Olenna and the High Sparrow might have succeeded. The monarchy would have come under the heel of the Faith, and House Tyrell's wealth would have fueled that new order. Perhaps we would have seen a pious golden age in King's Landing, or perhaps just another form of tyranny, cloaked in religious righteousness. In the end, we are left with the knowledge that the Game of Thrones is never simple. The High Sparrow's moral crusade and Olenna Tyrell's worldly cunning formed a potent alliance indeed. Yet still it was not enough to counter a single, monstrous act of alchemical terror. Ironically, the The same faith that believed so devoutly in the Seven's protection failed to anticipate the very human evil that lurked in Cersei Lannister's heart. And the same coin that Olenna spent so lavishly could not buy absolute victory, for money cannot always foresee every hidden path. But in another telling, in another branch of possibility, we might imagine a triumphant procession. The High Sparrow, austere but firm, leading Margaery Tyrell down the steps of the Great September to be crowned queen beside Tommen. Cersei, in chains, her pride reduced to rubble, is led away to face her sentence. Olenna Tyrell watches from the side, her heart light at seeing her granddaughter's success, secure in the knowledge that the coffers of Highgarden will shape the city's future. The crowd cheers. The bells ring in celebration rather than mourning. The Great September stands in white marble splendor rather than a smoldering crater. A new age of devout rule, perhaps untested but full of promise, dawns upon Westeros. Alas, for all her intelligence and cunning, even Olenna Tyrell could not fully account for the darkest corners of her enemy's mind. Even the High Sparrow, with all his moral certitude, could not guard against a sin that defied any rational limit. That is the cost of underestimating a wounded lioness. Cersei, in her final blow, showed that the lines between piety and power, between justice and vengeance, can be obliterated in an instant by raw, unyielding ruthlessness. And so, in the real turning of events, the alliance of faith and coin was as fleeting as a candle flame before a wave of wildfire. If only, one might lament, they had been a bit more careful, a bit more ruthless themselves. If only they had recognized that for all their planning, they needed an even stronger hand to grip Cersei's throat and extinguish the last spark of defiance in her. Then, perhaps, they would have triumphed. But if only is the refrain of so many in Westeros, echoing through the halls of broken keeps and abandoned thrones. In the end, the story that came to pass was written in green flame, and its embers smolder in the memories of those who survived it. Olenna Tyrell would go on to carve her vengeance in another way, forging new alliances, making new bargains, eventually confessing to Jaime Lannister that she was responsible for Joffrey's death, but also ensuring that her final words would haunt Cersei's realm. Her alliance with the High Sparrow, that fleeting hope of revolution and reform, is now but an intriguing footnote in the annals of Westeros, a great what-if overshadowed by the savage reality of war and betrayal. The notion of uniting faith and coin against a common enemy was bold, but in the brutal landscape of kings and queens, cunning and cruelty often trump even the best-laid plans. And so ends the tale of how Olenna Tyrell's partnership with the High Sparrow sought to overthrow Cersei by faith and coin, only to see that vision consumed by the harsh truth that in the Game of Thrones, one does not merely kneel to prayer or weigh purses of gold. One must also face the flaring, unstoppable power of a desperate foe who will do anything, absolutely anything, to emerge victorious. The Seven, if they truly exist, might have wept for what transpired that day. Or perhaps they simply turned their faces away, leaving mortal men and women to settle their fates amid the ashes of the Great September of Baelor. You said, continue 6,500 words. Reasoned about Olenna Tyrell and the High Sparrow for 17 seconds. Building upon historical alliances. Continuing the narrative with Olenna Tyrell and the High Sparrow, they strategize using faith and coin to address Cersei's tyranny, setting the stage for an epic political and religious showdown, navigating strategic landscapes. Imagining Olenna Tyrell and the High Sparrow's continued alliance, they decipher Cersei's sabotage or prevent it, ensuring their unified strategy against Cersei progresses without canonical constraints. Cracking the code. Imagining Tyrell guards stealthy infiltration of the catacombs, they locate the wildfire cache, potentially alerting Tommen, blackmailing Cersei, or finding another creative solution. Crafting the narrative. Olenna Tyrell and the High Sparrow work to replace Cersei with Margaery as queen. The story could unfold through an alternate timeline where Olenna learns of the wildfire plot or continues beyond the previous scenario. Mapping the journey. I'm piecing together the narrative with Olenna and the High Sparrow's triumphant alliance, including the gradual shift of Tommen and Margaery towards the faith, aiming to thoroughly explore theocratic monarchy changes. Olenna Tyrell had always known that the Game of Thrones demanded not only cunning but foresight. As she departed, the last, charred image of kings landing in her mind, a smoldering crater where the Great September once stood, She was tormented by the ghost of what might have been. The vision of an alliance between faith and coin had flickered brightly, a nearly unstoppable tide of popular devotion funded by her endless gold. And yet it had taken only one monstrous act of desperation to turn that alliance to ash, incinerating her granddaughter, the High Sparrow, and so many others in a single green-flamed roar. In the uneasy silence after the wildfire explosion, Olenna had fled the city. That was the reality that had come to pass. She stood upon the deck of a slow barge sailing the Blackwater toward the open waters of the sea, bound for the fair fields of the Reach and eventually High Garden. With her were the remnants of the Tyrell court. Maids, guards, cooks, stewards, and most of them wore the same stunned, grieving expressions. Had one not known better, the sight might have appeared merely that of an older lady traveling in subdued dignity. But beneath her calm mask, Olenna felt only one thing: a need for vengeance that burned with a clarity rivaling the wildfire's green inferno. Time drifted as the barge cut through the water. She stared at the city walls behind her, receding with each passing hour, and she swore to herself that if there was any power left in her old bones, she would not rest until Cersei Lannister paid for this horror. Grief sat upon her like a stone. She had lost Margaery, Loras, even that fool of a King Tommen who had, in his naive way, at least offered the promise of a peaceful rule under Margaery's guidance. The budding alliance with the Faith had all been undone. And yet, for all that heartbreak, Olenna understood the necessity of pressing forward. There would be time to mourn when she had retaliated in full. She stood at the stern, a battered cloak shielding her from the briny wind. The day's sunlight dimmed in the west, turning the waters orange and gold. Her personal guard, a tall man called Gareth who had served House Tyrell for over a decade, approached quietly. He was unaccustomed to seeing his mistress so wordless. "My lady," he said gently, "we've nearly reached the river mouth. From there we can sail round the coast to the Mander, or we can disembark and travel overland. Which would you prefer?" She did not turn from the water. "The overland route will be faster. If there's anything left of order in this realm, it will be on the Rose Road, our road. We return to High Garden with haste. Arrange for horses the moment we dock." Gareth inclined his head. "Yes, my lady." She said nothing else, and he left her to her thoughts. Olenna's mind churned with recollections of the weeks prior, recalling every meeting with the High Sparrow, every vow of mutual cooperation. She remembered that first conversation, her moment of realization that if she wanted to free Margaery and Loras, she needed to meet Zeal with coin. They had nearly succeeded. Even after Margaery was freed, their combined influence had grown each day, overshadowing Cersei's power. If only, she thought bitterly, they had cast Cersei down sooner. But regrets were worthless. Time marched on, and if one did not march with it, one was left behind in the rubble. Perhaps there was a different path. Perhaps in some twisting corridor of fate, she and the High Sparrow had uncovered the wildfire plot in time, or compelled Cersei to remain in the September as well, forcing her to share in the same annihilation. It was an easier fantasy to cling to than the reality of her granddaughter's death. The next day found Olenna and her traveling party disembarked at a small port village, where they secured enough horses and wagons to begin the journey inland. Fields of tall grass and scattered farmsteads stretched before them, the summer's warmth still lingering in the southern air. Every few miles, they encountered refugees or peddlers from King's Landing, carrying bundles of possessions as they fled the city's tumult. Rumors were already flying. Some said that half the city had burned, that thousands were dead. Others whispered that Cersei Lannister was now Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, having crowned herself in the wake of the tragedy. The city's bells had tolled both for the High Sparrow's destruction and for Tommen's death. People whispered that the gods had turned their faces away from King's Landing. For Olenna, each rumor was another brand against her heart, fueling her determination to see Cersei undone. She also realized that if Cersei had truly seized the throne, the Tyrells stood at the brink of war. Not a distant war fought against Stannis or Renly or any pretender, but a direct confrontation with the Lannisters. Both sides had been uneasy allies under King Tommen. That alliance was now beyond repair. The Tyrell banners would have to be called. soldiers mustered. A full-scale conflict might erupt, and that was a terrible thing for the realm. But to Olenna's mind, the realm was already doomed if it meant living under a queen willing to burn her own city to destroy her enemies. They passed a small orchard, where orchardmen had paused in their labors to watch the Tyrell procession ride by. Olenna did not stop for pleasantries. She was known for her sharp tongue and direct manner, and even now, with sorrow weighing upon her, that clarity of purpose had only sharpened. She had a single destination in mind: Highgarden, seat of her power and the heart of the Reach. If she was to orchestrate the next move in this deadly game, she would do it from her own domain. Each day brought more travelers crossing their path, fleeing in all directions. The roads were choked with wagons. Some recognized Olenna and called out for news, but she offered them little comfort. Curiosity churned in her mind about the scattered remnants of the faith militant. Had any survived the blast? Were pockets of sparrows still seeking justice? The High Sparrow had consolidated so much power. He had men in dozens of septs across the city. But by killing their leadership in one blow, Cersei must have shattered that movement. A pity, Olenna thought. For all her disagreements with the High Sparrow's moral severity, his broad support among the small folk could have been a critical tool in dethroning Cersei. Now that tool lay, quite literally, in ashes, and so she pictured in her mind a different scenario, an alternate tapestry of events. The High Sparrow, made cautious by the knowledge that Cersei had once threatened to burn the city rather than lose it, might have decided to tighten security around the Great September, doubling the faith militant presence in every tunnel, every secret passage. Olenna's own gold might have financed an investigation of the catacombs, unearthing the rotting barrels of wildfire that had lain dormant since the days of the Mad King. In that scenario, she imagined the faith's novices hauling out the barrels in plain sight, the city's population gathering to witness this hideous weapon being paraded through the streets, tarnishing the Lannister name once and for all. With such a public display, the faith and House Tyrell could have forced Cersei into open confession of her monstrous plan. Then, at the trial, the evidence of her intent would have sealed her fate: execution or life imprisonment in a distant septry. Tommen, spared the horror of his mother's final betrayal, would remain on the throne with Margaery at his side. That was the tapestry of an alternate future Olenna could still see when she closed her eyes. Had she realized the depths of Cersei's cunning, she would have pressed the High Sparrow to proceed more quickly. She would have quietly enlisted her own guards to investigate the hidden rumor of wildfire. She would have placed her granddaughter beyond the September's walls until the moment of trial truly arrived. But hindsight was a cruel tutor. She had recognized Cersei's desperation, but not the absolute extent to which she would act. One evening, camped beside a shallow river with bulrushes swaying in the dusk, Olenna found she could not sleep. She wandered away from the tents, lamp in hand, picking her way through the grasses until she reached a small clearing by the water. The night crooned with insects. The hush of the water was a gentle lull. She remembered nights in Highgarden's orchard when Margaery was just a girl, chasing fireflies and giggling among the rose bushes. Loras would be behind her, teasing her about how princesses belonged in castles, not in the mud, and Margaery would laugh in that musical voice of hers. Olenna thought of how bright Margaery's eyes had been, so full of ambition and cunning, like a younger version of Olenna herself, but tempered with a compassion that had endeared her to so many. Those memories felt like a dagger in the old woman's chest. She swallowed, forcing herself to remain composed. In that moment, though, she sensed a presence behind her. She turned abruptly, lamp raised, to see a hooded figure step forward. A man's silhouette, his arms raised to show he meant no harm. "My lady," the stranger said softly. He wore simple clothes, and at first glance he might have been a traveler. But then she noticed something beneath his cloak, a faint glint, shaped like a seven-pointed star. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice quiet but laced with tension. "You have no place wandering unannounced into my camp." The man lowered his hood. He was young, perhaps no more than 20. His head was shaved close, a faint patch of dark hair just beginning to regrow. His eyes were clear, intense. "My name is Orwyn, my lady. I was once a sparrow in King's Landing, in service to the High Sparrow. I recognized you on the road this morning. Please allow me to speak." She exhaled through her nose. Every instinct told her to wave for her guards, who were no doubt within earshot if she let out a cry. But something in this young man's gaze gave her pause. She gestured for him to go on. "Very well. Speak, and be brief." He took another careful step closer, then knelt. It was the posture of supplication, as though she were queen. "I was on the outskirts of the city when it happened, my lady. The explosion at the September. Most of my brothers and sisters died that day, burned or crushed beneath the rubble. I only survived because I'd been assigned to one of our soup kitchens near Flea Bottom. When the word reached me, and I saw the green flames rising over the roofs, I fell to my knees. The High Sparrow was everything to us, a living symbol of the Seven's will." He paused, voice trembling. "Now, with him gone, our ranks are scattered. A few of us have fled. Others remain, trying to keep hope alive. I couldn't stay there, not with the city how it is, so I followed you, my lady." Olenna raised a brow, suspicion crossing her features. "Followed me? Why would you do that?" "Because you believed in our cause once. Not as a convert, but as a benefactor. You gave gold, you helped set up new seps, you believed in the idea that the small folk deserved better. I'm not fool enough to think you did it for purely holy reasons," he added hastily. "But we both wanted the same thing, to cast down the corruption in King's Landing, especially that of Cersei Lannister. You wanted to free your family. We wanted to restore the faith to its rightful place. Perhaps we can still work together." That last phrase echoed faintly in Olenna's mind. "We can still work together." It was like hearing the ghost of the High Sparrow. She let a measured silence stretch, her eyes flicking over him. A part of her wanted to dismiss him outright. The faith had failed, and House Tyrell had lost everything. But another part of her recognized that she could ill afford to spurn any potential ally, especially one who might know secrets from the faith's network of informants. "Did you not witness how thoroughly that ended?" she asked, her voice low. "My family is gone, your High Sparrow is gone, and the faith militant is in ruins. What more can be done?" He lifted his chin, a flicker of passion brightening his eyes. "But your house remains, my lady, and it is still powerful. The High Sparrow might be gone, but the Seven remain. There are still those in the streets of King's Landing and across the realm who resent what Cersei has done. People are horrified. They fear her, but their anger runs deep. In a sense, the faith's cause has grown even stronger in their hearts, because they see how sin and corruption can destroy entire lives in a single moment. They want justice for the Great September. They blame Cersei. If we can rally them, if we can bring that indignation to a boil, we might finish what was started. We might truly tear down the Lannister queen." Olenna studied the young man's face in the wavering lamplight. "And you think House Tyrell should lead this effort?" "I do," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "Or at least, I believe you can supply the gold and the influence. The faith is broken, but not all of us are leaderless. A few Septons survived, though they've gone into hiding. We still have enough spiritual authority if we can unify, but we lack arms and coin. You have armies, you have connections. If you stand against Cersei, and if you let us help rally the small folk in your name, rather than the name of the crown, well, you might find that the next time you march on King's Landing, half the city throws open the gates." He was speaking of open rebellion. Olenna felt an old jolt in her chest, part excitement and part trepidation. Even with her thirst for vengeance, she recognized that any attempt to depose Cersei would be a dangerous undertaking. But as she looked at this young man, a living, breathing reminder of what the High Sparrow had accomplished, she realized that the faith's remnants could still be a potent force. The notion of combining that zeal with Tyrell resources was exactly what she had done before. The difference now was that they would be operating from a position of rage, no longer confined by illusions of partial cooperation with the crown. This would be a pure, unadulterated revolt. "And why should I trust you?" Olenna asked. "For all I know, you might be one of Cersei's spies, trying to lure me back into a trap." He shook his head vehemently. "I've no love for the Lannisters. My parents died years ago in a food riot, while the crown did nothing. The High Sparrow was the only reason I found purpose in life. I am loyal to the Seven, my lady, and I cannot stand idly by when Cersei flouts the gods' justice. But I am only one man. If you turn me away, I'll find others in the countryside who share my anger, gather them however I can. We'll become outlaws, I suppose. But if you accept my help, I promise I will not betray you. Let me serve you in the cause of retribution." She let the silence linger again, hearing the night wind sigh across the reeds. His sincerity seemed genuine enough. Her instincts told her that Cersei had spies who were far more cunning than this young man, whose earnestness was almost painful in its transparency. Could she glean any advantage from taking him under her wing? The question practically answered itself. Of course she could. "You realize I have no illusions about the faith now," she said. "I do not share your piety. I'm an old woman, with no illusions that the Seven are going to intervene. This is politics, boy, power at its most naked." He bowed his head. "I understand, my lady, but if your ends align with ours, does it matter whether you call it politics or faith?" Olenna allowed the faintest curl of a smile. "Sometimes, no." "Very well, then. You may travel with my party to Highgarden. You will do nothing without my permission. You will speak to no one outside my household without telling me first." "Understood." He looked relieved, bowing again. "Yes, my lady. Thank you." She nodded curtly and walked past him, lamp in hand. "Come along now. Stay close. My men will want to frisk you for weapons." She paused, turning back to him with a final, stony pronouncement. "If you do betray me in any way, you'll regret it before your next prayer." He said nothing, only inclined his head in agreement. Together they returned to the camp. Olenna's guard, Gareth, was startled to see a stranger with his lady, but at Olenna's nod, he allowed the young man to pass after a quick pat-down. The two men exchanged wary glances. Olenna retired to her tent, letting the lamp's soft glow guide her to her cot. Sleep did not come easily, but she felt the faint stirring of possibility in her chest. The faith might have been decapitated, but it was not entirely dead. And if it could still rouse a legion of the small folk who hated Cersei, perhaps her granddaughter's death would be avenged after all. In the days that followed, Orwyn remained mostly silent, walking at the rear of Olenna's entourage with two guards on either side. He did not complain about the conditions of the journey, even when dust caked their clothes and the sun beat down mercilessly. Olenna kept an eye on him, occasionally riding alongside to probe him with questions. She learned that he had been a street urchin in King's Landing before the High Sparrow's movement offered him a sense of belonging. He had helped serve bread and stew in the makeshift kitchens, had prayed at the foot of the Great September Daily, and had listened to the High Sparrow's sermons about how the mighty would be cast down for their sins. "Do you truly believe all that?" Olenna asked him one afternoon, as they rode through farmland dotted with poppy flowers. "That the mighty must be cast down?" He glanced up at her, shielding his eyes from the sun. "I believe sin should be cast down, my lady, whether it's in the hearts of the mighty or the lowborn. The High Sparrow taught us that wealth should serve the common good, that lords and ladies have a responsibility to the realm. I know you see the world differently, but to me all men are equal under the eyes of the Seven. Power is an illusion that leads to pride, and pride leads to ruin." She snorted softly. "Power is the only thing that keeps your poor from starving. My family's power feeds half the realm. There's virtue in that." He nodded, though it was clear he found her perspective incomplete. "I won't deny that coin can be used for good, if guided by righteous hands. That's why I believe you and I still have common ground. You have coin. The faith's remnants have moral authority among many poor folk. We can still do something meaningful." She let that stand. The talk of moral authority always pricked at her sense of realism. But she couldn't deny that the small folk had once rallied behind the High Sparrow with almost mystical zeal. If a fraction of that fervor remained, it could tip the balance in a confrontation against Cersei. They pressed onward, crossing the Mander at a shallow ford. From there, it was another few days' ride to the broad, rolling hills that signaled the outskirts of the Tyrell domain. The land grew lush, bursting with wildflowers. Even so late in the season, the climate was pleasant, a testament to why the Reach was the envy of other regions. Towering oaks lined the roads, and farmland stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with patches of shining gold fields of wheat. After the horrors of King's Landing, the beauty of the countryside felt like an illusion, as if none of the realm's ugliness could reach this place. Olenna knew better. War would come here as well, if Cersei intended to punish the Tyrells for defiance. At last, they beheld Highgarden on the horizon. Rising atop a gently sloping hill, the castle's pale stone battlements and graceful towers were surrounded by terraced gardens in bloom. Even from a distance, one could see the swathes of green hedges and bright roses that gave the seat its name. A broad moat encircled the walls, fed by a branch of the Mander. Beyond the gates, the roofs of the castle's inner keep and its many spires and balconies called to mind a city within walls, more refined than King's Landing, more open and airy. And behind all that, the rolling fields of the Reach stretched toward the horizon. As Olenna's party neared the gates, a horn was sounded from the walls. The gates opened, and out rode a small group of armored knights bearing the Tyrell sigil, a golden rose on a field of green. At their head was Lord Tarly, a tall man in steel plate, his helm carried by a squire. Randyll Tarly was a proud and stern commander, known for his discipline. He had once served House Tyrell loyally, though Olenna knew he was a man of strong personal convictions. He had heard rumor of the city's calamity, no doubt, and was prepared for anything. The moment Randyll reached Olenna, he dismounted and bowed. "My lady, I've been awaiting your arrival. Word reached me of a terrible disaster in King's Landing. I'm sorry for your losses. If you command it, the full strength of the Tarly banners is yours." Olenna inclined her head in thanks, her expression grave. "Thank you, Lord Tarly. We have much to discuss. But for now, let us enter Highgarden. The city has fallen under the thrall of Cersei Lannister's treachery. We must prepare for what's to come." With that curt exchange, the group proceeded through the castle gates. Highgarden's courtyards were alive with activity. Servants moving quickly with produce from the fields, stable boys tending to well-bred horses, small knots of guards patrolling with halberds. The sweet scent of blooming roses lingered in the air. Olenna found it almost jarring after the stench of smoke and terror she had left behind in King's Landing. She turned in her saddle, glancing back at Orwyn. He rode behind her, flanked by Gareth and another guard, but his eyes were wide with awe as he took in the grandeur of Highgarden. Olenna almost smiled. She recalled that the High Sparrow had often railed against the excesses of the nobility and their great seats of power. Yet, ironically, it was within these very seats that decisions shaping the fate of the realm were made. They dismounted in the main courtyard, and servants rushed forward to assist, curtsying or bowing. Olenna gave short instructions to have her baggage taken to her quarters and for a meeting to be convened in the Solar within the hour. Her bannermen would be summoned, along with key household members. She did not trust half the courtiers in Highgarden, but she knew she needed them for the moment. As she walked inside, leaning slightly on her cane, the difference in atmosphere was striking. Highgarden's polished stone floors, bright tapestries, and open windows were a world away from the claustrophobic gloom of the Red Keep. She inhaled the sweet air, letting it calm her. Still, the moment's comfort could not erase the anger simmering in her blood. In the privacy of her personal chambers, Olenna allowed the servants to fuss briefly, removing her travel-stained cloak, offering fresh water in a gilded basin. She took a moment to wash her hands, eyeing the old, wrinkled reflection in the mirror. She had never been vain, but she realized her face looked more gaunt, her eyes ringed with shadows. Marjorie's face flickered in her mind again, gentle and poised. Olenna's hands clenched around the basin until her knuckles turned white. A knock on the door. Gareth's voice came from the corridor. "My lady, everyone has gathered in the Solar." She dried her hands and breathed deeply before exiting. A servant opened the door to the Solar, a bright room with tall windows overlooking one of Highgarden's many courtyards. The gathered men were some of her highest-ranking bannermen and advisors. Randyll Tarly in his polished breastplate, Lord Chester from a lesser branch of the Tyrell line, a few of the senior knights who had once served Mace Tyrell. In the corner stood a pair of ladies, attendants who oversaw the domestic side of Highgarden's domain. They all bowed or bent the knee when Olenna stepped in. Without preamble, she walked to a high-backed chair near a marble table and sat. She motioned for them to rise. "We have little time for ceremony, so I'll be brief. The rumors you've heard are true. The great September of Baelor was destroyed by wildfire. Everyone inside, my granddaughter Marjorie, my grandson Loras, countless others, were all burned alive. Cersei Lannister arranged the entire thing and has crowned herself queen now that King Tommen is dead." She let the shock ripple around the room, though most had already guessed the substance. "By the Seven," one of the knights murmured. Another knight's face flushed with anger. The ladies near the wall exchanged horrified glances. Olenna continued, her voice unyielding. "House Tyrell stands bereft of its heirs. My son, Mace, was with the royal retinue in the city as well. He too is dead." She paused, letting them absorb that blow. "We have no illusions left about any alliance with the Lannisters. Cersei has effectively declared war on our house by murdering nearly all of us." Lord Tarly stepped forward. "My lady, this is unconscionable. With all due respect, we must prepare for open hostilities. The Reach has the largest armies in Westeros. Let us march on King's Landing at once and put an end to the Lannisters' tyranny. The small folk there will not stand for this atrocity, I am sure. If we move quickly, we may find them ready to rise up in support." There was a murmur of agreement from several bannermen. Olenna, however, shook her head. "We must move carefully, Lord Tarly. While I share your fury, charging headlong at the capital might only force Cersei to repeat her vile trick. We do not know what caches of wildfire remain in the city. She has proven she will destroy it all if it suits her. We cannot risk the lives of our men in a hasty siege, nor do we want to slaughter half the city's population in the process. A queen who would use wildfire once can do so again. But if we wait too long," said a knight, "she may tighten her grip on the capital, gather whatever loyal forces remain to the Lannister name." "Let her gather them," Olenna said, voice cold. "We will not fight her on her terms. We must ensure that the city's small folk, the survivors of the faith, and any disaffected nobles are all aligned against her. When we march, it must be with not only a large army, but also with the certainty that the city's gates will open to us. We must starve her of resources and allies until she has nothing left." Another wave of conversation washed over the room. Randyll Tarly squared his shoulders, giving Olenna a respectful nod. "As you say, my lady. We will begin strengthening our own defenses at once. We will call the banners from across the Reach. But, if I may ask, who leads House Tyrell now in name?" "You are the Lady Dowager, but the official seat would have passed to—" "Do not concern yourself with that," Olenna snapped, though not unkindly. "I am the sole authority in Highgarden now, and you will answer to me. Our next priority is retribution for this atrocity. Once that is secure, we can worry about inheritance." "Understood." He bowed deeply. "Yes, my lady." A moment of tension followed. Olenna's mind flicked to the question Tarly had raised. By all normal inheritance laws, the seat of Highgarden should pass to a male relative in the Tyrell line. But the only living Tyrells in the direct line, Marjorie, Loras, Mace, were gone. Perhaps there were distant cousins, but Olenna had neither the time nor the inclination to abide some lesser branch taking the seat from her. She would run Highgarden until her dying breath, ensuring the correct vengeance was enacted. If after that some upstart cousin wanted the seat, they could pick over the scraps. She cleared her throat. "One more thing. I have among my retinue a Sparrow, a survivor of the faith militant. He claims there are others who might rally to our cause, small folk across the realm who are outraged by Cersei's act of sacrilege. We will discreetly encourage them. A widespread uprising in the Crownlands, perhaps even in other regions that resent the Lannisters, could weaken her. I intend to meet with this young Sparrow in the coming days and see if his words have merit." Lord Chester spoke up. My lady, I caution you. The Faith Militant and the High Sparrow caused chaos before. They nearly turned on us, too, at times. She nodded. I'm well aware. But the commoner's anger is a powerful weapon, provided it's aimed correctly. And right now, I want it aimed at Cersei. Her expression was set in stone. We will be cautious, but we will make use of whatever advantage we can find. The meeting continued for another hour, hashing out details of mustering the bannermen, preparing supply lines, and reinforcing Highgarden's walls. Olenna rarely had to speak twice. The men recognized that a reckoning was at hand. When at last she dismissed them, they bowed and filed out, leaving her alone in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She sat there a moment longer, hands folded in her lap. She pictured Marjorie's face again, that day on the September steps when she had confessed her sins in a measured performance. It had been a moment of triumph disguised as humility. The crowd had loved her. Now that memory was like a knife in the heart. Cersei might gloat on the Iron Throne, wearing black velvet and a golden crown, but Olenna Tyrell vowed that the queen would not enjoy her spoils for long. One way or another, she would see the House Lannister undone. That night, she summoned Orwyn to the Solar after supper. He arrived escorted by a pair of guards, who hovered near the doorway. Olenna dismissed them with a wave, allowing the young Sparrow to stand before her in private. The flickering candelabras cast dancing shadows across the walls, revealing the tension in his posture. "My lady," he said, bowing. She gestured for him to sit on a wooden stool opposite her. "You've had time to see Highgarden. I trust you're not scandalized by our finery." He shook his head. "It's certainly more luxurious than any place I've known, but I won't deny it's beautiful." Olenna leaned forward slightly. "Let us speak plainly. You claim pockets of the faith remain, scattered though they may be, and you say they could incite the people's rage against Cersei. How would you accomplish this precisely? The High Sparrow once rallied the city's small folk with his sermons and charitable works. But with him gone, and with the Faith Militant decapitated, who could unify them now?" Orwyn inhaled. "We do still have some Septons who escaped the destruction. They are not well known like the High Sparrow, but they carry enough authority to speak in the name of the faith. If I can reach them, persuade them to stand together, they could call on the devout across the Crownlands to protest and resist the Queen. It might begin as small gatherings in local septs, praying for the souls lost in the Great September, condemning the use of wildfire. It would spread by word of mouth until a wave of condemnation falls upon her. Small folk, tradesmen, even minor lords who resent the Lannisters' tyranny, they could be inspired to rise up, refusing to pay taxes or harbor the crown's men. And if your gold supported them, if your men offered covert protection, they'd have a chance." Olenna tapped her cane lightly on the floor. "And how do you propose to slip in and out of the Crownlands without being captured by the gold cloaks or worse? The faith always had secret routes, my lady. Safe houses that were used to hide the faithful from the crown's prying eyes. I know a few of them. I see. We'll start with those. Gather what remains of our network. If they see I have your blessing and your resources, they might believe there is still hope." She pursed her lips in thought. "You realize that if you're caught, you'll be tortured for information on our plans." A flicker of fear crossed his face, but he nodded. "I do. And you still volunteer?" He pressed his hands together. "Yes, my lady. I've lost too many friends to that green fire. I can't stand aside." Olenna studied him for a long moment in the candlelight. The rawness of his conviction was tangible. She was well aware he was stepping into a role that might easily end in his death, but it was a risk she was more than willing to take if it meant stirring an uprising. As a piece on the board, he was more valuable as a messenger than as a warrior. "I will grant you a handful of loyal men to see you safely to a point near the Crownlands," she said at last. "From there, you'll have to move discreetly. I'll also provide some gold. Not a great deal at first, you'll need to prove you can accomplish what you say. If you succeed, if you manage to rouse a significant portion of the small folk, then we'll expand." "Agreed." He exhaled in relief, nodding. "Agreed. And one more thing. Olenna added, her voice turning icy. If the men I send with you disappear, or if you desert us, I promise that I will hunt you down. I am done suffering betrayals. Yes, my lady, he said without hesitation. You have my word. I won't betray you. She gave a small wave of dismissal, and the guards escorted him out. Olenna remained in the solar, thoughtful. She was gambling, in a sense, but then again, in the aftermath of such devastation, all she had left was cunning and coin, and a raging thirst for vengeance. If Orwyn could stoke the fires of revolt among the common people, so much the better. If not, her fallback plan was to muster the Reach's armies and starve King's Landing out if necessary, though that could take months and lead to thousands of deaths. Preferable, if she could, would be to make Cersei's own people turn against her from within. In the days that followed, Randyll Tarly made good on his promise to muster the bannermen. From every corner of the Reach, knights and foot soldiers began arriving, swelling Highgarden's garrison and encampments to record numbers. Wagons of supplies trundled in daily, while blacksmiths worked overtime forging swords and repairing armor. Olenna ensured that messages were sent to the other major lords of the Reach, requesting they send their forces as well. Some responded swiftly, sharing in the outrage over King's Landing's atrocity. Others were more cautious, uncertain whether challenging the crown directly was wise, even under a queen as widely despised as Cersei. But day by day, Highgarden became the nucleus of a powerful war effort. Amidst the bustle, Orwyn prepared for his secret mission. Olenna's steward arranged a modest sum of gold in discreet pouches, along with rations and plain clothing for the men who would accompany him. She had chosen 5 of her best, men loyal to her personally, skilled enough to guard the young Sparrow but not so high profile that they would draw immediate suspicion. 2 of them had traveled the Crownlands before, and thus knew the roads well. On the morning of their departure, Orwyn came to bid Olenna farewell in the courtyard. He wore a threadbare cloak and carried only a simple staff, looking every bit the wandering novice. The 5 guards, similarly dressed in nondescript leather jerkins, waited behind him, their faces set in grim determination. "My lady," Orwyn said, bowing, "pray for me if you will." She tilted her head, giving him a pointed look. "I'm not the praying kind, boy, but I do wish you luck." With that, Orwyn and the men set off through the gates. Olenna watched them go, ignoring the twinge of doubt in her chest. She had placed a measure of trust in him. Would it be rewarded, or had she simply sent him to his doom? Time would tell. While Orwyn traveled north, Olenna oversaw the continuing mobilization of the Reach. Reports filtered in of unrest in King's Landing. The city was quieter than usual, its population cowed by the memory of wildfire. Cersei had replaced the Faith militants' presence with her own red-cloaked guards, along with certain Sellswords loyal to the crown's gold. The rumor was that she spent much of her time in the Red Keep, suspicious of every shadow. Yet she had also begun sending out royal decrees, demanding that all the lords of the realm acknowledge her as rightful queen. Some complied, particularly those in the Westerlands, Lannister territory, but many simply did not reply. The realm was in disarray, and winter was on the horizon. One letter reached Highgarden that piqued Olenna's interest. A raven from the Iron Bank of Bravos, politely inquiring about the crown's outstanding debts and hinting that they might be open to negotiations with House Tyrell. It seemed that, with the Lannisters in chaos, the Iron Bank had lost much of its faith in the crown's ability to repay. Olenna saw in this a potential advantage. If she could secure the Iron Bank's favor, she might cut off the crown's lifeline and secure additional funding for her war. So she penned a careful reply, inviting a representative of the bank to Highgarden for discussions. Likewise, she reached out subtly to certain lords in the Stormlands, who had little love for the Lannisters since the days of Robert Baratheon. Although that region was ravaged by war and lacking a clear leader, Olenna's letters promised better trade routes and protection in exchange for any help in destabilizing Cersei's hold. Slowly, the web of alliances began to spin. It was reminiscent of the old days, when her daughter-in-law Allery used to tease that Olenna was the spider of Highgarden, weaving quiet plots while Mace Tyrell took credit for 1,000 small machinations. But all of Olenna's cunning was now focused on one outcome: toppling Cersei Lannister from her stolen throne. Weeks passed with no word from Orwyn. Olenna began to suspect he might have been captured or killed, or perhaps he'd abandoned the cause altogether. Yet she continued her preparations, refusing to be paralyzed by uncertainty. Lord Tarly urged her to take more direct action, insisting that with each passing week, Cersei might strengthen her defenses or coerce more houses into her camp. Olenna was firm. She wanted every advantage lined up before they made a move. Then, one crisp morning, a rider arrived at Highgarden's gates just after sunrise. He bore a rolled parchment sealed with no sigil. The guards brought it to Olenna as she was finishing her breakfast in the castle's airy dining hall. She broke the plain wax seal and read, "My lady, we have begun our work. A septon named Martin has gathered a small congregation in Rosby, where they pray daily for the souls lost at the September of Baelor and condemn the use of wildfire. We are spreading the word that our queen was murdered by the same monstrous act, that the realm must rise against such sin. Others in nearby towns have taken up the prayer as well. We go on to Stokeworth next, and we expect more gatherings. The small folk speak of rebellion in hushed tones, but they need a spark. We will provide that spark. Your gold has been well used so far, feeding the faithful who gather. We hope to stir them further in the coming weeks, if the crown does not move against us first. Pray for our success. Orwyn." Olenna read it twice, a slow smile curling her lips. So the boy was still alive and apparently making progress. She passed the note to Gareth, who raised a brow as he skimmed it. "He's stirring them up," she said. "Good. That's precisely what we need. Another month or two of this, and half the Crownlands might be murmuring for revolution." Gareth nodded, though he maintained the stoic caution of a seasoned guard. "Cersei will clamp down the moment she hears of it. She won't sit idle while people openly pray for her downfall." "Let her clamp down," Olenna said. "The more she cracks her whip, the more resentment will build among the small folk. They'll remember the promise of the faith that once fed them, protected them. And this time, they'll have no illusions about who the tyrant is." Indeed, within a fortnight, word reached Highgarden that crown soldiers had begun arresting small folk found at these seditious prayer gatherings. Yet that only fed the outcry, as families of the arrested cried out for justice, claiming their loved ones were merely praying for the dead. A story spread of a septon in Rosby who had tried to shield an old woman from the soldiers and had been whipped for his trouble. The indignation roiled through the Crownlands, igniting a wave of anger reminiscent of the early days of the High Sparrows movement. Except now, there was no official figurehead to bargain with the crown. Only scattered septons and novices, making them far harder to stamp out completely. Meanwhile, Olenna and Randall Tarly continued forging alliances. An envoy from the Iron Bank arrived, a thin man with watchful eyes, who spent 2 days in negotiations with Olenna. The result was a tentative agreement. The bank would freeze future loans to Cersei's regime, pressing her for immediate repayment of existing debts. Meanwhile, they would open a line of credit to House Tyrell, provided Olenna offered certain guarantees of repayment once Cersei was deposed and the realm stabilized. Olenna agreed, offering the bountiful wealth of the Reach's harvests as collateral. It was a risk, but a calculated one. If she failed in her campaign to topple Cersei, the Iron Bank might ruin her house financially, if the Lannisters didn't ruin it first. But if she succeeded, she would have both the Iron Bank's favor and the realm's richest farmland at her back. Lord Tarly showed some reluctance at using foreign gold, but Olenna dismissed his concerns. "Gold is gold," she said simply. "If we can use it to recruit additional sellswords, fund more supplies, and bribe certain uncertain houses into joining us, it's worth the cost. Once Cersei is gone, the realm will be ours to shape anew." So the wheels of rebellion turned in tandem. On one side, the seeds of discontent took root among the common folk in the Crownlands, stoked by Orwyn and his clandestine septons. On the other side, the Tyrell armies grew in strength, forging pikes and swords and stockpiling grain for a potential siege. A certain sense of grim destiny hung over Highgarden. The men drilled in the courtyard from morning to night, the hammering of the smiths echoed across the ramparts, and ravens flew in and out with letters that Olenna read promptly. She wore her mourning black in memory of Marjorie and Loras, but her mind was fixed on war. All the while, she could not help but replay that single catastrophic moment in the Great September, the instant a spark touched the hidden wildfire. She envisioned how differently it all could have gone had her alliance with the High Sparrow succeeded at the trial. Cersei convicted, Marjorie ascending in glory beside Tommen. What would the realm have looked like under such a union of faith and coin? A gentler monarchy, perhaps, or maybe just another brand of tyranny, she sometimes admitted. The High Sparrow had not been a man known for compromise, but at least Marjorie and Loras would have lived. At least the city would not have been ripped apart by that monstrous explosion. Yet regrets changed nothing. She had to focus on the present, on the tangible path that might still lead to justice. The game was far from over, and her hand was still strong. She was the richest woman in Westeros now that the Lannister gold mines had run dry. She had the largest armies in the realm at her disposal. And she had the righteous fury of the people, if Orwyn's efforts succeeded. In combination, those forces might do more than just overthrow Cersei. They might reshape the very nature of the Iron Throne if Olenna so willed it. A day came when Orwyn himself returned, disguised as a simple traveler, just as the harvest was reaching its peak. He arrived unannounced at the gates of Highgarden with 2 of the 5 guards she had sent with him. The other 3 had apparently fallen along the way, 1 to crown soldiers, 2 to bandits. But Orwyn and the survivors had accomplished much. Olenna summoned him at once to her private study. He knelt before her, panting from the long ride. "My lady, we have done as you asked." The Crownlands seethed with anger. Cersei has begun ordering mass arrests of Septons who speak publicly against her. This has only made the small folk angrier. In some towns, they've chased away the gold cloaks or killed them outright. It's becoming an open rebellion. The movement lacks a single figurehead, but many cry out for House Tyrell to save them from the tyranny of the Mad Queen. That is the name they give her now, the Mad Queen, in reference to the Mad King's wildfire obsession. Olenna felt a surge of satisfaction. "Excellent. Are you certain the city itself will follow suit if we march upon it?" He bowed his head. "It's hard to say. The city is still filled with those who fear the Queen's wrath. But if your army were to appear in force, and if an organized effort inside the city opened the gates, yes, I think it could work. The people hate her. They speak Marjorie's name with reverence, cursing the day she was taken from them." She exhaled, eyes glittering. "They do well to remember my granddaughter. Very well, Orwyn. Your efforts have not been in vain. Now it falls to us to press the advantage. We will call for a march within the fortnight." At that, Orwyn's face lit with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "My lady, there is one more thing. The Crown has begun hoarding food in the city, confiscating grain from the surrounding farmland. They anticipate a siege. If winter sets in, it may become a grueling standoff. The small folk will suffer." Olenna arched a brow. "That's unfortunate, but it might also force the people to revolt more swiftly. Hunger has a way of making peasants desperate." "I understand," Orwyn said, though his tone carried a hint of sorrow. "I just pray there will be a way to spare them the worst." She studied him. For all that he preached about devotion, he had a keen sense of the pragmatic. "We do what we must," she said, trying not to let her mind drift to the memory of Marjorie's philanthropic gestures. Her granddaughter had genuinely cared for the small folk. Olenna mostly viewed them as a resource, but Marjorie's empathy had given their house a veneer of compassion that people admired. Perhaps, for Marjorie's memory, Olenna would at least try to be mindful of the people's suffering when the time came. But the priority was removing Cersei from the throne, no matter the cost. As the fortnight progressed, Randyll Tarly and the Bannermen organized the Tyrell forces in earnest. Thousands of men gathered in the fields outside Highgarden, forming camps that stretched for miles. Infantry drilled with spear and shield, cavalry exercised daily. Train carts were loaded with provisions, bread, salted meats, barley, fruit preserves. Blacksmiths hammered day and night. From the castle walls, One could see the fluttering banners of lesser houses sworn to Tyrell, their sigils adding color to the sea of tents. One evening, after a full day of reviews, Olenna convened a small war council with Randyll Tarly, Lord Chester, and a few of the more seasoned knights. Maps were spread across a massive oak table in the great hall, with candles flickering. She stood at the head, cane in hand. "Here is our plan," she said, tracing her finger across the map. "We will divide our forces into two. One, under Lord Tarly, will march directly toward King's Landing along the Rose Road, making it clear we intend to besiege the city. The other, under Lord Chester, will circle north, approaching through Stokeworth. That smaller force will attempt to coordinate with the rebels in the Crownlands, ensuring that key gates or roads are seized. We must surround the city so that any attempt by Cersei to flee or bring in reinforcements is thwarted." Lord Chester frowned. "But dividing our army leaves each portion at risk if Cersei musters a large force to strike one group first." Olenna lifted her chin. "We have reason to believe that many of the Crown soldiers are not wholly loyal to Cersei. Also, the Lannisters themselves have been weakened by recent conflicts in the Riverlands. Jaime is away, dealing with Riverrun or the Blackfish, last I heard. Cersei's only reliable forces might be the remnants of the gold cloaks and whatever sellswords she has purchased. They are not likely to march out in open battle against us, not when they can hide behind the city walls and the threat of wildfire. But that threat means we must surround them completely and wait for internal revolt to open the city from within. Is that clear?" The men nodded gravely. Randyll Tarly stroked his short beard. "Yes, my lady. We will do as you command. Once we are in position, we give the signal to the rebels inside the city, and if all goes well, they will fling open the gates rather than submit to more tyranny." "That is my hope," Olenna said with an edge in her voice. "But we must be prepared to starve them out if we must. A direct assault would be madness. We can never forget what happened to the September. There is no telling how much wildfire remains under the Red Keep." A hush fell over the group as they recalled the horrors of that day. Then Tarly tapped the map. "We will rely on your man Orwyn to coordinate with the city's rebels. If they're well organized, we might not be out there long." After the council ended, Olenna lingered in the great hall alone, studying the map in the candlelight. The enormity of her plan weighed on her. She was about to launch a siege of King's Landing, something that had not been done lightly by any house in living memory. Stannis had tried and failed, Tywin Lannister had saved it from others, the Targaryens had used dragons in centuries past. Now, in her old age, she was about to direct a campaign that could determine the fate of the realm. She pressed a hand to her chest, remembering Marjorie once more, as though her granddaughter stood behind her, whispering reassurances. There was no question that this was the right course, she told herself. Cersei had committed an unforgivable crime. Even if Olenna had to become a butcher, she would do it to see the Lannister queen brought to justice. By the time the 2 columns of Tyrell soldiers set out from Highgarden, late summer had given way to the first chills of autumn. The banners snapped in a cool breeze as thousands of men marched across the fertile fields, their armor glinting under a pale sun. Olenna traveled with Tarly's main force, riding in a covered litter for comfort. She despised traveling by litter under normal circumstances, but her advanced age left her little choice. She wished she could ride a horse, if only to show the men that she did not fear the road. Still, her presence at the head of the host was enough. The common soldiers knew she was with them, which gave them confidence. Rumors circulated among the rank and file that the Queen of Thorns herself would lead them to avenge the beloved Queen Marjorie. Some of the men chanted Marjorie's name in cadence, vowing to avenge her death. The roads were still fairly tame, though the region near the Blackwater had grown more tense. Refugees, hearing of the Tyrell advance, scurried out of the Crownlands or toward the Stormlands, trying to stay ahead of any potential battle. Olenna's outriders escorted them away without violence. He had given orders not to harass small folk unnecessarily. If the realm was to see the Tyrells as liberators, they could not behave like tyrants themselves. Scouts rode ahead to gauge the city's condition. Each day, new reports arrived. Cersei had indeed stationed men on the walls, and no one was allowed in or out without close scrutiny. Sellswords patrolled the main gates, wearing black and gold. The banner above the red keep bore a lion's head, no longer even bothering with the Baratheon stag. Word was that Cersei barely left the keep, relying on Qyburn's network of little birds for intelligence. The populace was sullen, some openly hostile. Crown soldiers still roamed the streets, ready to stamp out any sign of insurrection, but the rebels had gone underground, waiting for the Tyrell host to appear. After nearly 2 weeks of steady marching, Tarly's main force reached the outskirts of King's Landing. From a rise, Olenna peered out of the litter's window at the familiar skyline. The city walls of dull gray stone, the red keep perched upon the eastern hill. Smoke from countless chimneys drifted into a hazy sky. She felt a grim pang, remembering the last time she'd approached these gates, when she was still merely an adversary of Cersei, not an outright enemy in a war. Felt like a lifetime ago. They set up a massive encampment on the western side of the city, near where the Gold Road turned into the main route to the gates. Hundreds of tents sprang up, supply wagons ringed in a defensive formation. Pikes were driven into the ground, watch fires lit at sunset. The men formed patrols along the roads, intercepting any traffic. Meanwhile, Lord Chester's smaller force was positioning itself near Stokeworth, hopefully to create the sense of an encirclement. If all went as planned, the city would soon be cut off from reinforcements or supplies. That same evening, Orwyn slipped away from the main camp with a handful of men, intending to contact the rebels in Flea Bottom. Olenna gave him final instructions. Find out how ready the people were to rise, how many had weapons, and which gates or sections of wall might be turned from within. Should the city's defenders appear too strong, he was to wait until the Tyrell forces weakened them with a blockade. But if opportunity arose, a swift overthrow from within could save countless lives, and spare them the risk of any wildfire. All was set. Olenna felt her nerves strumming tight as a bowstring. Each day now was borrowed time, a gamble on whether the city would break from within or whether the Tyrells would have to enact a full siege. The nights in camp were quiet, the men subdued, aware that the real test lay mere miles away behind those gray walls. On the second night, a rider approached under a flag of truce, escorted by half a dozen crown soldiers and met by Tyrell outriders. It was a messenger from Cersei, a sleek young man with carefully combed hair and a swagger in his posture. They brought him to Olenna's command tent, where he surveyed the warlike surroundings with forced confidence. He bowed theatrically. "My Lady Olenna, I bear a message from Her Grace, Queen Cersei of the House Lannister, rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms." Olenna eyed him coolly. "You must be either very foolish or very brave to step into my camp. Let's hear it." He nodded, clearing his throat. "Her Grace demands that you withdraw your troops at once and cease your treasonous aggression. She is willing to forgive your hostile posture if you disband within a day's time. Otherwise, you will face the full might of the Crown's wrath, and you will be named traitors to the realm." A hush fell over the tent. Lord Tarly, standing at Olenna's side, glowered, one hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Olenna merely laughed, a sound as dry as leaves. "Forgive us? After what she did to my grandchildren? Does the Queen truly believe I would ever kneel to her again?" The messenger swallowed, but kept his composure. The events in King's Landing were tragic, but necessary to root out the faith's corruption. "Get out!" Olenna snapped, her voice suddenly cold with fury. "Return to your so-called queen and tell her that the Tyrells will never bow to a king or queenslayer. She murdered my family, and for that, no forgiveness is possible. Remind her that the food she so desperately needs to feed the city all comes from our fields. We will starve her out if we must. She can burn down King's Landing if she likes, but she'll be left with nothing but ashes and the curses of every living soul in the realm." The messenger hesitated, perhaps debating some further retort. But the steely gaze of Randall Tarly was enough to silence him. He bowed stiffly, turned on his heel and left. Olenna waved a hand, and 2 guards escorted him away. Thus ended the only attempt at negotiation from Cersei. There would be no parley, no final offers. Olenna had put her cards on the table. War it was, and the only question remaining was how long it would take for the city to break from within, or for her to find a way to nullify the wildfire threat. Days stretched into a week. The blockade began in earnest. Tyrell patrols scoured the nearby countryside, capturing or turning away wagons that might be trying to reach the city with supplies. At night, the watchers on the Tyrell ramparts could see lanterns flickering along the city walls. Word reached the camp that the prices of bread and grain in King's Landing were already skyrocketing. People were panicking about the prospect of another famine. Tension crackled in the air. Finally, one evening, a runner from Orwyn arrived at the Tyrell lines. He reported that Orwyn and the rebel septons were nearly ready. They had identified a section of the city wall near the dragon pit that was lightly guarded. If the Tyrells staged a feint at one of the main gates, the rebels might be able to slip out and open a postern gate for the Tyrell vanguard to flood in. From there, they could seize control of Flea Bottom and move toward the main gates, letting the rest of the army pour in. It would still be dangerous, but if the Crown's defenders were caught off guard, the city might fall with minimal bloodshed. Olenna convened her war council and agreed to the plan with some caution. She insisted that the soldiers who entered the city first must search for any sign of wildfire caches near that sector. The last thing she wanted was to succeed in breaching the walls only to have Cersei ignite half the city again. Randyll Tarly agreed, though he advised speed. The faster we can neutralize any threat, the less chance she has to use it. Thus, on a chilly dawn, the Tyrell host formed ranks. Randyll Tarly, in full armor, led a massive contingent toward the main gate, making a great show of preparing to storm it. Drums boomed, banners fluttered, and horns blared. Enough commotion that the defenders along the gate must have thought an all-out assault was coming. Meanwhile, a smaller, elite force of Tyrell knights slipped away to the east, guided by Orwyn's runner, creeping around to the postern gate near the old dragon pit ruins. Olenna remained at the command post, nervous tension gnawing at her. She imagined Cersei skulking in the Red Keep, eyes wide with hatred, Qyburn's wraith-like figure whispering about hidden barrels of wildfire. Would they dare unleash it again? If so, it might kill thousands, including the Lannister loyalists themselves. But Cersei had already proven she cared nothing for such consequences if it meant eliminating her enemies. The drums on the main line thundered. Through her spyglass, Olenna could see the city's gate bristling with defenders, archers perched behind crenellations, scorpions aimed at the Tyrell ranks. At a signal from Tarly, the men began a slow, methodical advance, launching a barrage of flaming arrows at the walls, mostly to keep the defenders pinned down and create the illusion of a genuine assault. Smoke and shouts filled the air. Hours seemed to pass, though it was likely only a quarter of that, while the ruse continued. Olenna's heart pounded each time she imagined a sudden column of green fire erupting behind the city walls. But it never came. Instead, she began to notice a strange commotion on the ramparts. It looked as though the defenders were fighting among themselves. Some men turned from the battlements, blades drawn, as if dealing with an attack from the rear. Then, all at once, a cry went up from the Tyrell lines. A portion of the city gate was being thrown open. From a distance, Olenna saw a swirl of figures in the gateway, some in peasant clothing, some wearing the rose sigil, battling the crown guards. "Go! Now!" Randyll Tarly roared to his second-in-command. Trumpets blared, and the Tyrell infantry surged forward with a fierce cry, slamming into the confused defenders. In moments, they had overwhelmed the gateway. Dozens of crown soldiers threw down their arms or tried to flee into the city streets. Olenna's breath caught. Could it really be happening so swiftly? She urged her litter-bearers forward at a brisk walk, flanked by cavalry. The city's walls loomed closer, and inside, the sound of battle rose, swords clashing, men shouting. Smoke drifted from a few burning barricades. Women and children scrambled out of the way. Yet through the chaos, Olenna glimpsed something incredible. The rebels, peasants armed with pitchforks and old swords, were cheering the Tyrell banners, chanting the name Marjorie. Some had taken up the seven-pointed star again, brandished on scraps of cloth. Randyll Tarly met Olenna inside the gate, his armor streaked with soot. He bowed quickly as she dismounted her litter. "My lady, we've secured the gate district. The defenders here didn't put up much of a fight. Seems half of them were only there under threat. Now the small folk are turning on the rest." Olenna nodded, her face grim. "And the wildfire?" He shook his head. "None so far. We found no sign of it here, though that doesn't mean it isn't hidden deeper in the city. The Red Keep is still heavily guarded." "Then we press on," Olenna commanded. "Secure Flea Bottom. Encourage the small folk to remain calm. If any more crown soldiers wish to surrender, let them, so long as they swear not to take up arms against us again. But no mercy for the Queen's personal guard if they resist." Randyll Tarly saluted and turned to lead the next push. Tyrell troops fanned out, forming a defensive perimeter as they moved inward. Orwyn suddenly appeared from a side alley, breathless, with a group of ragged rebels. He rushed to Olenna, bowing. "My lady, we have the main thoroughfare locked down. The people are with us. They hate Cersei with a passion. The real fight will be at the Red Keep. Her personal guard and any sellswords are there. She's barricaded herself inside." "Then we break those barricades," Olenna said, lifting her chin. "But carefully. I will not see another wildfire atrocity. Send men to search the cellars and tunnels around the keep. If there are caches, I want them found." With that, the Tyrell forces advanced through King's Landing. Smoke from scattered fires filled the air. The streets rang with echoing cries. Some citizens emerged from their hovels to toss rotten food at any crown soldier they saw. Others cheered the Tyrell soldiers, waving scraps of cloth with the golden rose drawn on them. The faith's remnants, septons and novices, appeared among the crowd, chanting prayers for the souls lost in the September bells tolled in half-ruined septs, a solemn refrain. At the foot of the Red Keep's hill, a makeshift barricade had been constructed by Crown loyalists. They launched crossbow bolts at the Tyrell men who ventured too close. But with the city turning against them, their position was untenable. Randyll Tarly organized the infantry into shield walls, advancing step by step. A volley of arrows soared overhead, pinning defenders behind their barricade. In the confusion, a wave of Tyrell pikemen stormed forward, smashing the blockade. The loyalists wavered. Many dropped their weapons and ran, while a handful fought to the death, crying out, "For the Queen!" It was over in minutes. Now the Red Keep's gates stood in plain sight, tall and shut. Archers peered from the walls. Olenna, still riding in her litter, approached carefully, flanked by Tarly and Orwyn. If wildfire was anywhere, she suspected it might be beneath this fortress. A hush fell over the Tyrell ranks as they arrayed themselves before the keep. The city behind them was largely theirs, but the final prize, Cersei, remained locked inside. The walls were high. Catapults had not yet been brought from the main camp. And who knew what horrors lay waiting behind those walls? Olenna stared up at the battlements, her voice carrying loudly in the strange silence. "Cersei Lannister, face me if you dare. Or have you lost your taste for fire?" For a moment there was no response. Then, from above, a single figure appeared at the rampart. Olenna squinted, her old eyes trying to discern who it was. She saw a man in dark robes, Qyburn, undoubtedly. He gazed down with an air of cold detachment. He spoke, though not loudly. Someone on the battlements relayed his words in a booming voice. "The Queen will not speak with traitors. If you do not depart, you will face the same fate as those who threatened her before. Every tunnel beneath this keep is primed with wildfire. Take one more step and all will burn." A tremor rustled through the Tyrell men. Some looked anxiously at each other, as if expecting to see green flames erupt at any moment. Olenna's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew he might not be bluffing. She remembered how Aerys Targaryen had once planted caches throughout the city, hoping to burn it rather than lose. Cersei might have done the same. Orwyn stepped forward, speaking quietly to Olenna. "My lady, perhaps we should hold back. Starve them out. They can't have enough food for a long siege, not with the city in open revolt. If we rush the keep, she might ignite it." Randyll Tarly nodded. "We can keep them penned in, blockade the keep from all sides, and search for the wildfire caches in the surrounding tunnels. Eventually, they will have no choice but to surrender. Olenna considered. The practical side of her agreed that a siege might be the surest path to victory. But a darker part of her, fueled by fury, wanted to see Cersei dethroned at once, dragged out in chains. She wrestled with that urge, reminding herself that the cost could be catastrophic if they rushed in blindly. She could practically hear Marjorie's voice in her head, urging compassion for the thousands of innocents who might perish if Cersei decided to light the spark. She tightened her grip on her cane. "We do this carefully," she said. "No direct assault for now. We fortify the Red Keep's perimeter and begin to unearth every tunnel or cellar that might lead inside. If we find any sign of wildfire, we clear it. Once we are certain they can't burn the city again, we will breach the keep. If it takes weeks, so be it." The orders were given. Tyrell soldiers set up a second ring of fortifications around the base of the keep. No one would enter or leave without Olenna's say-so. Over the next days, search teams fanned out, guided by local knowledge from rebels who had served in the city. They pried open old cellars, rummaged through storerooms, prowled the labyrinth of passageways under Visigna's hill. In several places they found suspicious barrels, sealed with wax. One hapless soldier pried open a lid and discovered the bright green gleam of wildfire within, carefully stored. Olenna had them remove the barrels, gingerly, to the courtyard near the main gate, where they were doused in barrels of sand and water. It was a delicate operation, but as the days went on, more and more caches were discovered and dismantled. The city watched these efforts with a mixture of awe and relief. With each barrel removed from the catacombs, the people of King's Landing cheered. They recalled too well the horrors of the Great September. Now, House Tyrell was quite literally saving them from the threat that still lingered. Meanwhile, inside the Red Keep, Cersei and her retinue remained silent, refusing all parley. By the third week of the keep's siege, morale in King's Landing had soared among those who despised Cersei. Tyrell soldiers patrolled the streets, working with local militia to keep order. Free bread was distributed at old Faith-run kitchens, financed by Olenna's coin. The small folk, in a reversal of fortunes, hailed Olenna Tyrell as a savior, though she herself rarely emerged from her vantage point near the keep, directing the final stage of the plan. She had lived to see the city under Tyrell control, something she had scarcely dared imagine when she first traveled to King's Landing long ago. But there was still one piece unfinished: capturing Cersei. Search teams had found so many wildfire barrels that it seemed unlikely the Queen had any left stored near the Red Keep's heart. But they could not be sure. They had to proceed with caution. Each day, Tarly's engineers brought the siege towers and heavy rams closer, building wooden palisades around them. Crossbowmen kept a watch on the Red Keep's walls, but the defenders rarely showed themselves anymore. It was as though they holed up in the keep's halls, waiting, or plotting. On a stormy night, thunder rolling across the sky, a sentry spotted a lone figure standing atop the battlements, a woman in black, wearing a crown. Cersei, lit by flashes of lightning, peered down at the city that had turned against her. The sentry reported that she appeared silent, her golden hair wet and plastered to her cheeks, her expression distant. Perhaps she was grieving for Tommen, or for the illusions she had once held. But in Olenna's mind, it was the posture of a lioness still refusing to yield, even when trapped. Another week passed, and the engineers declared that the final approach could be made with siege towers. Randyll Tarly gave the order. At dawn, they would begin the assault on the Red Keep's outer walls. Should the defenders try to set off any hidden wildfire, the Tyrell men stationed inside the subterranean passages would do their best to extinguish it. The time had come to end the standoff. Olenna slept poorly that night, plagued by dreams of green fire raging through the castle, devouring everything in its path. She saw Marjorie's face in the flames, calling out silently. She woke before sunrise, heart hammering, and dressed in black robes. Her guards helped her to a vantage point near the forward siege lines, so she could witness the final blow firsthand. Trumpets blared in the pale dawn light. Under Tarly's direction, the siege towers creaked forward, covered in dampened hides to help protect them from flaming arrows. A thunder of drums signaled the archers to unleash a volley, pinning any defenders behind the battlements. Step by step, the towers advanced across the muddy ground, bridging the moat with hastily built platforms. The first tower clanged against the wall, and a drawbridge slammed down. Tyrell soldiers poured out onto the battlements, swords and shields at the ready. To their surprise, there was minimal resistance. Most of the Lannister soldiers who remained had either deserted or been posted at the gatehouse. The fighting was fierce there, but it did not last long. The Tyrell men outnumbered them, buoyed by their sense of righteous vengeance. Inch by inch, corridor by corridor, the invaders pressed inward, clearing each level of the keep. When at last the main gate of the Red Keep swung open from the inside, thrown wide by Tyrell men who had won the gatehouse, the crowd outs, it erupted in cheers. Olenna, still in her litter, was borne inside, flanked by knights. The sunlight fell on the keep's courtyard, strewn with the bodies of those who had resisted. A hush fell as the Tyrell soldiers parted for Olenna Tyrell, letting her through to the foot of the keep's grand staircase. At the top of those steps stood Qyburn and a handful of trembling courtiers, none of them soldiers. They held no weapons. Qyburn appeared strangely calm, though lines of worry creased his face. He gave a slight bow, the mockery of deference. "My lady, you have forced your way in, it seems. Her grace is... Where is she?" Olenna snapped, voice cutting. He hesitated. "Inside the throne room. She awaits you." Guards seized Qyburn, dragging him aside. Olenna rose from her litter, insisting that they help her climb the steps on her own feet. Leaning heavily on her cane, she ascended. Behind her, the Tyrell knights advanced, weapons drawn, ready for any last trap. But there was no sign of wildfire in the corridors, no sign of hidden archers. The few defenders left had surrendered. As Olenna neared the throne room's massive doors, she heard them creak open. A swirl of torchlight flickered beyond. She entered, lips pressed tight, scanning the hall that had once witnessed the crowning of kings. At the far end, upon the Iron Throne, sat Cersei Lannister in a black gown, a golden crown resting on her pale hair. Her eyes were ringed with shadows, her features gaunt. Yet she kept her back straight, hands gripping the armrests of the throne as though she would not let go even in death. No courtiers stood at her side. No knights guarded her. She was alone. Olenna stepped forward, her boots echoing on the marble floor. She was surrounded by Tyrell soldiers, but she lifted a hand to signal them to keep their distance. She wanted this moment for herself. The Queen of Thorns versus the self-proclaimed Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Cersei's gaze raked over Olenna, bitterness and hatred shining there. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Cersei's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "You must be pleased, crone," she said, her voice hoarse. "You've won. You've destroyed my house. Is this what you wanted?" Olenna clenched her cane, a swirl of conflicting emotions inside her. Triumph, grief, rage, a strange sorrow for what might have been. "I wanted justice," she said, each word measured. "You killed my grandchildren. You blew them to pieces in that cursed September. Did you truly think I'd ever let you sit here unopposed?" Cersei gave a hollow laugh, leaning back against the throne. "Everything I did for my children, and they're all gone now. So let the city burn, for all I care." "You will not burn it again," Olenna hissed. "We've removed your wildfire caches. The people despise you for what you did." Cersei let out a long breath, and for the first time, a flicker of defeat wavered across her face. She looked somehow smaller, as though the very seat beneath her, the Iron Throne, forged by dragons, no longer responded to her presence. "So this is how it ends, then? You want me to beg for mercy? Will you cut off my head right here in this hall?" Olenna's mouth twisted. "If I had my way, I'd see you suffer as my grandchildren did. But I'm not here to give you the mercy you never showed us. The people want you punished. The faith wants you punished. I'd be a fool to let you live." Cersei's smile turned bitter. "Then get it over with, old woman. At least I won't have to watch you preen over Marjorie's memory. The little Rose was never half as clever as she thought. At that, Olenna lifted her cane as though to strike, a burst of fury boiling in her. But she held back, controlling herself, mindful of the soldiers watching. "You have no right to speak her name," she whispered. Then she gestured to Randall Tarley, who stood a few paces behind, sword in hand. "Take her." 2 knights advanced. Cersei made no move to resist. She simply stared ahead, the golden crown glinting on her head. 1 knight removed it, tossing it aside, and the other forced her arms behind her back, binding her wrists with rope. In that moment, Olenna recalled the High Sparrow's words about sin and atonement, about how the mighty would be cast down. She saw the prophecy fulfilled. The once powerful queen had been stripped of everything, her children, her throne, even her illusions. Cersei was marched down the dais steps, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. At the threshold, she paused, half turning to spit at Olenna's feet. Olenna did not dignify it with a response. She simply watched as they dragged Cersei away to the black cells. The realm might debate her fate, imprisonment, trial, or execution. Olenna felt a flare of savage satisfaction. At last, the murderer of her beloved Marjorie was in chains. The next hours were a whirlwind. Tyrell soldiers swept through the keep, disarming or arresting any remaining loyalists. Qyburn was found skulking in Maegor's holdfast, rummaging through his workshop. He was taken to the dungeons as well. The monstrous Ser Robert Strong, actually Gregor Clegane's reanimated corpse, had apparently been destroyed during the fighting, though details were hazy. Some said a group of rebel faith militants had confronted it with wildfire bombs, ironically turning the Queen's own terror weapon against him. Orwyn, among others, circulated the rumor that it was a sign the gods were punishing unnatural creations. By nightfall, banners bearing the Tyrell rose hung in the Red Keep's courtyard. The people of King's Landing roamed the streets in a frenzy of celebration, praising the end of Cersei's reign. Some prayed in the half-ruined September of Baelor, mourning the dead, but also giving thanks that the city had not been burned again. Olenna found she could not join in the revelry. She stood on a balcony overlooking the city, exhausted. Flames from torches and lanterns made the streets shimmer in the darkness, and she thought back to that day Marjorie had confessed on the steps of the September, the small folk crying her name. Now they cried the Tyrell name again, but Marjorie was gone. This was the answer to the question of what might have happened had the faith with Tyrell Gold overthrown Cersei. In truth, it had been messy, half destroyed by the wildfire horror before it could be realized. But in the end, faith and coin had come together anew, forging a final uprising that dethroned the Mad Queen. Olenna had achieved vengeance, yet it felt hollow. The city was saved, but Marjorie would not be there to reap the love of the people she had once cultivated so shrewdly. A gentle step behind her. She turned to see Orwyn, his robes stained with soot and blood, but his expression bright. "My lady, the people wish to see you, to honor you for—" She waved a hand. "They can wait. I'm not the queen. Let them celebrate their freedom without me." He frowned slightly. "But they see you as the liberator. You in House Tyrell. If you stand before them now, you'd solidify your hold on the city, on the realm. They want reassurance." Olenna paused. In the quiet of her own mind, she recalled that she had never actually desired to wear a crown. That had been Marjorie's dream. Olenna had simply wanted her family to flourish, her enemies to be destroyed. Now, with the city under her control, what would become of the Iron Throne? She could place a puppet on it, or claim it in the name of some distant relative. Or perhaps she would allow the faith to have a strong voice in governance, though never again would she risk letting them hold so much power unchecked. Her voice sounded weary, even to her own ears. "I will address them in time," she said. "For now, let them rest. Let them eat and sing and dance. Tomorrow, we will speak of what sort of realm we shall build from these ashes." Orwyn hesitated, then bowed. "As you wish, my lady." When he left, Olenna remained on the balcony, gazing at the faint silhouette of the ruined September in the distance. She could almost picture Marjorie's face there, radiant in torchlight, wearing a gentle smile. The memory brought a sting of tears to Olenna's eyes, tears she seldom allowed herself to shed. All of this was for Marjorie and Loras, for her son Mace, foolish though he was, for everyone consumed by that vile explosion, and for every small folk or Sparrow who had believed that faith and coin could reshape the realm. In the end, they had done it. They had toppled Cersei, albeit after immeasurable pain and loss. Perhaps the Seven, in their mysterious way, had finally answered the faithful's prayers. Or perhaps it was all just mortal cunning, steel, and gold. Olenna did not know if there was a difference anymore. She only knew that vengeance was done, and the world would never be the same. As dawn broke the next day, an unexpected hush fell over King's Landing. The fighting was finished. The city belonged to House Tyrell and its allies. The people awoke to find green banners hanging from the Red Keep, the lion sigils of House Lannister torn down or burnt. Soldiers patrolled the streets, but they did not harass the populace. They carried bread and water, distributing them to the poor with a sense of renewed purpose. A few Septons who had survived the chaos now ventured out, blessing the crowd, reminding them that the gods might be merciful. Many still grieved, but in that grief, they discovered new hope. The terror had passed, and the queen who once threatened them with wildfire was now in chains. Olenna Tyrell eventually stepped onto a makeshift platform in the courtyard outside the keep, flanked by Lord Randall Tarly and Orwyn, as well as a smattering of other bannermen. Hundreds of citizens had gathered to glimpse the infamous Queen of Thorns, the woman who had outmaneuvered Cersei Lannister. She surveyed them, seeing the exhaustion in their eyes, the lingering fear, but also an undeniable gratitude that the city still stood. She raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent. A breeze fluttered the black mourning garb she still wore. She spoke, her voice echoing, "People of King's Landing, you have suffered greatly, too greatly. The one who unleashed wildfire upon you, who murdered your queen and your kin, sits in a cell beneath the Red Keep. That reign of terror is ended. I do not pretend to be your savior, but I have come to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. The Tyrells will provide food for the city. We will rebuild what was destroyed, and we will ensure the justice that was denied you." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Some shouted Marjorie's name. Others lifted the seven-pointed star in homage to the faith. Olenna let them vent their emotions. Then she continued, "I am old, and I have seen too many wars. Let this be the last if we can help it. You have my word that we will seek an end to the cruelty that once stained these walls. But I cannot do it alone. House Tyrell shall lead, but with your consent." She trailed off, momentarily struck by the knowledge that this was the city her granddaughter had sought to rule with gentle compassion. Marjorie had wanted to be adored, and she had indeed been adored until the moment of her death. Now, the old woman found herself in that role, stepping into the place that might have been Marjorie's. Felt both fitting and unbearably sad. The people cheered, albeit in a subdued way, as though they were still unsure how to fully rejoice. But the relief was palpable. When Olenna descended from the platform, Orwyn regarded her with admiration. "You've given them hope, my lady." She nodded, giving him a tight smile. "Let's see that we keep it." In the days that followed, trials were arranged for those who had collaborated too closely with Cersei. Some were pardoned if they could show they had acted under duress. Others, like Qyburn, faced the stern judgment of the new administration. He was found guilty of black sorcery and treason, executed by the faith's novices. The Red Keep's labyrinth was carefully searched. Dozens more wildfire barrels were removed, ensuring no future horrors would be visited upon the city. Cersei herself was held under close guard. Many demanded her immediate execution, but Olenna chose a more deliberate path. She recalled the High Sparrow's fondness for public confessions and humiliations, though she took no pleasure in the concept of parading a naked prisoner through the streets. Still, she knew the crowd clamored to see Cersei brought low. In the end, a trial was convened in the throne room, ironically the same place where she had once brazenly held power. A panel of judges, including senior Septons who had survived, presided. The charges were endless. Regicide, the murder of King Tommen, if only indirectly, the destruction of the Great September, the murder of Margaery Tyrell, Loras Tyrell, and countless others. Cersei was led in chains before the court. She stood silent, her eyes dull, as the accusations were read. Olenna watched from a seat near the judges, her posture rigid. Part of her wanted to see Cersei wail in despair, to scream her guilt. But Cersei merely stared ahead, refusing to speak in her own defense. Perhaps she knew it was hopeless, or perhaps she was beyond caring. When the judges passed sentence, death, Cersei did not flinch. That night, on a raised scaffold in the Red Keep's courtyard, Cersei Lannister was beheaded with a single stroke of a sword. The crowd watched in tense silence. Some spat in disgust. Others murmured that the punishment was too quick, that she deserved more pain. Olenna did not attend personally. She remained in a tower balcony, looking out over the city's rooftops. When she heard the roar of the crowd that signaled the deed was done, she closed her eyes. Vengeance was complete, but Margaery and Loras were still dead. Nothing would change that. In the uncertain weeks that followed, the realm's attention turned to the question of succession. Who would sit the Iron Throne, now that Cersei and her children were gone? Some called for a great council to decide the matter, as the Targaryen line was thought to have ended except for rumors of Daenerys across the Narrow Sea. Others pressed Olenna to claim it herself, or to name a Tyrell cousin as king or queen. The faith, newly re-empowered, wanted a say in the next ruler's legitimacy. It seemed that the illusions of a stable monarchy might be unraveling. Yet for the moment, King's Landing was at peace. The Tyrell banners flew over its walls, the small folk were fed, and the city breathed easier without the specter of wildfire overhead. Olenna wondered if the High Sparrow might have approved of such an outcome, or if he would have insisted on a more pious reconstruction of the monarchy. He was gone, so it didn't matter. But the seeds he had planted lived on in men like Orwyn, in the deep devotion of the small folk. And the gold that Olenna commanded poured into rebuilding. Together, faith and coin had undone Cersei's tyranny, even if it had happened in a roundabout, bloody way. Sometimes, late at night, Olenna wandered the corridors of the Red Keep, reflecting on the many what-ifs. What if she had discovered the wildfire earlier, saving Margaery? What if the High Sparrow had been more guarded, less naive, forcing Cersei to stand trial surrounded by watchers? What if Margaery had truly reigned as queen, forging an era of reform with the faith as her ally? She could still see it in her mind. A city shining with septs for the poor, guided by a just monarchy, funded by Tyrell gold, beloved by the common folk. Instead, the city lay scarred, half the Great September gone, the memory of that green inferno haunting them all. But she had done what she could. She had avenged her family, and she had removed a monster from the throne. If the realm's future was uncertain, at least it was free of Cersei's madness. And perhaps that was all the victory an old woman could hope to achieve in a land so steeped in blood. One afternoon, Orwyn found Olenna in the keep's garden, where red and gold roses had been transplanted to breathe some life into the place. He gave a respectful bow, as always, then stepped forward. "My lady, the city is calm now. The faith is assisting in distributing alms. The people wonder who will rule next." She sighed, resting a hand on a rose's stem, careful of the thorns. "I suppose we all wonder. Part of me yearns to simply leave this wretched city behind, to spend my last days in Highgarden. But that would be irresponsible. The Iron Throne remains. Someone must fill it." Orwyn studied her with an earnest gaze. "You have the strength, my lady. Many would follow you." She shook her head, thinking of how Margaery had once stood on these very grounds, weaving illusions of benevolence. I'd erupted in cheers. Olenna, still in her litter, was borne inside, flanked by knights. The sunlight fell on the keep's courtyard, strewn with the bodies of those who had resisted. A hush fell as the Tyrell soldiers parted for Olenna Tyrell, letting her through to the foot of the keep's grand staircase. At the top of those steps stood Qyburn and a handful of trembling courtiers, none of them soldiers. They held no weapons. Qyburn appeared strangely calm, though lines of worry creased his face. He gave a slight bow, the mockery of deference. "My lady, you have forced your way in, it seems. Her grace is—" "Where is she?" Olenna snapped, voice cutting. He hesitated. "Inside the throne room. She awaits you." Guards seized Qyburn, dragging him aside. Olenna rose from her litter, insisting that they help her climb the steps on her own feet. Leaning heavily on her cane, she ascended. Behind her, the Tyrell knights advanced, weapons drawn, ready for any last trap. But there was no sign of wildfire in the corridors, no sign of hidden archers. The few defenders left had surrendered. As Olenna neared the throne room's massive doors, she heard them creak open. A swirl of torchlight flickered beyond. She entered, lips pressed tight, scanning the hall that had once witnessed the crowning of kings. At the far end, upon the Iron Throne, sat Cersei Lannister in a black gown, a golden crown resting on her pale hair. Her eyes were ringed with shadows, her features gaunt. Yet she kept her back straight, hands gripping the armrests of the throne as though she would not let go even in death. No courtiers stood at her side. No knights guarded her. She was alone. Olenna stepped forward, her boots echoing on the marble floor. She was surrounded by Tyrell soldiers, but she lifted a hand to signal them to keep their distance. She wanted this moment for herself. The Queen of Thorns versus the self-proclaimed Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Cersei's gaze raked over Olenna, bitterness and hatred shining there. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Cersei's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "You must be pleased, crone," she said, her voice hoarse. "You've won. You've destroyed my house. Is this what you wanted?" Olenna clenched her cane, a swirl of conflicting emotions inside her. Triumph, grief, rage, a strange sorrow for what might have been. "I wanted justice," she said, each word measured. "You killed my grandchildren. You blew them to pieces in that cursed September. Did you truly think I'd ever let you sit here unopposed?" Cersei gave a hollow laugh, leaning back against the throne. "Everything I did for my children, and they're all gone now. So let the city burn, for all I care." "You will not burn it again," Olenna hissed. "Garden." Instead, there was simply the realm, bruised, battered, yet still standing. And if the people looked to Olenna Tyrell as a matriarch of unyielding resolve, perhaps that was enough. In the quiet of that final reflection, Olenna Tyrell breathed in the faint perfume of roses. She remembered Margaery's voice one last time, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself smile. For better or worse, the game had been played to its end, and in the subdued hush of victory, she bowed her head to the memory of what might have been, and to what was. The realm would go on, and as the Queen of Thorns knew too well, life was as much about surviving regret as it was about seizing triumph. She whispered, though no one was there to hear, "We won, my little Rose, at a terrible cost, but we won." And the faint breeze across the garden might have carried a soft echo in reply, or perhaps it was only her tired mind imagining Margaery's voice, offering comfort in a realm that had known too little of it. Either way, Olenna let the sound, real or imagined, linger in her ears as she turned to walk back inside, leaving a swirl of rose petals in her wake.